Miss D. Dunmore Bryant by Pansy. Chapter 1. The Family Gathering. Daisy Bryant sat on a low chair in front of the fire, staring into the blaze. Her hands were folded idly in her lap, and her eyes had in them a look which the others called far away. Daisy was thinking. She did a good deal of thinking for a girl only 8 years old. The chair she sat in was a little old-fashioned splint-bottomed one, whose legs had been cut off, on purpose to make it a comfortable height for Daisy's little legs when they were shorter than at the time of which I write. Daisy still liked the chair very much, and always sat in it when she was thinking. The other furniture in the room matched Daisy's chair. That is, it was neither newer nor nicer in any way. There was not a great deal of it. The floor had a neat strip of rag carpeting over in the part which Daisy called the study. There was also a little square table over there, with the Bible on it, and Daisy's geography, and Ben's arithmetic, and a tiny basket that held Line's crochet work. At first, Daisy had objected to the crochet work, that it did not belong to a study, but one evening, in the very middle of Miss Sutherland's study table, what did she see but a fluffy ruffle with Miss Sutherland's needle set in its hem, and her thimble lying beside it? Since that time the crochet basket had held peaceable possession. In front of the stand was a high-backed chair, also of the old-fashioned kind. It used to have arms, but one of them had been broken in moving, and one day the other slipped out of place and fell on the floor. What Miss Bryant said when she saw it was, "Now if those rods which used to support the arms were taken out, that would make a good sewing chair." So Ben took the rods out, and a sewing chair it became. Ben had also contrived a neat little place under the stand, into which Mrs. Bryant's work-basket would fit. That work-basket was really a sore trial to Daisy. She felt very sure it ought not to be part of the furniture of a study. But of course Mother must sit with them in the long winter evenings, and part of Mother's life was that never-empty basket. One day a bright thought came to Daisy, or rather to Ben. "They have waste-baskets in studies always, I guess," Miss Daisy said, looking thoughtfully at the offending basket. "At least, Miss Sutherland does, and I suppose they all do. I can see how they would need them. But then yours isn't a waste-basket, is it, Mother?" "I don't know about that," Ben had said, just as the last quarter of his slice of bread was going into his mouth. "I think there's a good deal wasted out of my stockings by the time they are popped in there. The pair I wore last week were wasted so badly that my 2 big toes were nothing to speak of the last 2 days." "And I should say there was considerable waste to the elbow of your brown dress that went into the basket last night," Line said, reaching for a second baked potato, then deciding she would leave it to warm up. Line was 11, and had to do her share of the thinking. Daisy turned beaming eyes on her mother. "There is a sense in which it is a waste-basket after all. Don't you think so, Mother?" "Seems to be," said the mother, trying not to smile at Daisy's large phrases. "Seems to so, you mean, Mother," said Ben, who was always making puns, "to spice the dinner with," he sometimes told Line when they were having an unusually dry meal. Then they all laughed, and the question of the waste work-basket was comfortably settled. The study had almost no other furniture of its own, unless a pleasant window where the afternoon sun shone in, and lovely sunsets exhibited, may be called furniture. It had a neat white curtain, made of the better half of a sheet, the other part having wasted away. In the evening, when the work was done, Daisy's low chair, and Line's green-painted wooden one, and Ben's, from which the back was gone, moved into the study, where the arithmetic and geography, and sometimes a spelling book, held close attention, Line's swift fingers weaving her web of crochet while she studied. Daisy had dreams of a different study from this. She never peeped into Miss Sutherland's on the hill, whither she was often sent on errands, either to take home the new strip of crochet work or the pile of fresh handkerchiefs her mother had ironed, but she told herself, "One of these days we'll have a study just like this, hammock and all." For one of the things which especially took her fancy was that lovely gold-colored hammock which swayed gracefully to and fro, with Miss Sutherland looking lovely in her white cashmere wrapper, lounging in it, book in hand. The two great cottages of chairs, which were always in this room, Daisy decided should be one for mother and one for company. But as for Line and Ben and herself, she could never be quite sure just what sort of chair would be the best to read and study in. "I don't quite like the cottages for studying," she would say reflectively, "because, you see, they are so soft and fluffy that all I want to do when I get into one is curl up in a nice ball and think. And I can't ever study well when I want to think." There was a shout of laughter over this, and Ben said that because Daisy did her studying without any thinking, must be the reason why she always wanted to spell believe E-I instead of I-E. But Mrs. Bryant took Daisy's part, declared she understood her perfectly, and that she did not think Miss Sutherland's cottages were good chairs for studying. So that matter was still unsettled. As to the part of the room where Daisy sat, which did not belong to the study, there was a cook stove, which at this moment was aglow, not so much because the day was unusually cold, as because Mrs. Bryant needed some irons heated just right for very fine ironing. Her table and ironing board occupied quite a large space. Certain shelves ranged along the wall held all the dishes the small house owned, and these were hidden from dust behind neat calico curtains, drawn close. For the rest, there was another table where the kitchen work was done, with the little house under it, where the pots and kettles and pans lived, curtained in. A chair apiece for the four who belonged to the family, a beautifully clean floor, a bush in the south window that occasionally put forth a red rose, that was all. Poor? Well, Mrs. Bryant and Ben and Line knew that they were. Sometimes Daisy shrewdly suspected it, though the burdens of poverty were kept from her young shoulders as much as possible. She knew that their house was very small, ridiculously so, when compared with the Sutherland home. In fact, I will give you a glimpse of that little cottage as it shrank away from view behind the hill on that November day. Just a queer little cabin, with old-fashioned windows and doors, not intended for a house at all in the first place, but it had grown into one because of Mrs. Bryant's needs. Daisy knew that their mother had to work very hard to furnish even this small home with the necessaries of life. She knew also that in the busy season, Line and Ben had to work as hard as their mother, and as the busy season reached quite beyond the time for the schools to reopen in the fall, Line and Ben had been always behind in their studies, which had been a sore trial, not only to them but to Daisy, ever since she could remember, because she saw an intimate connection between that and her mother's sorrowful face and occasional tears. Now you are anxious to know what made the busy season, and what sort of work it was in which all, even Daisy, during this last year could help. Why, you must know that Mrs. Bryant lived in a village where there was a large canning factory. Here were canned all sorts of fruits and vegetables, peas and beans and corn and tomatoes, and some of the various sorts had a fashion of getting themselves ripe at the same time, and of crowding themselves into the factory with a determined air that said, "Take us now or not at all. We'll decay, we'll sour, we'll dry up, we'll ruin ourselves in some way unless you give us immediate attention." And so true to their word were they, that all the village grew into the habit of heeding their warning, and peaches were pared, and corn husked, and the little mill which cut it from the cob was fed as fast as two busy pairs of hands could push in the corn, and the great engine wheel whizzed around, and the great iron furnaces capable of taking care of several hundred cans at once were heated, and for days and days people flew around that great building as though everything that was worth caring for in this world was corn and tomatoes and a few such things. Within the last year Daisy had been promoted and allowed to work a few hours of each day in the factory. What do you think she did? You would never guess in the world, I believe, so I will have to tell you. Hour after hour were her small neat fingers kept busy laying shining little tin covers on the filled cans, ready for the hands of the man who sealed them on. Now confess, didn't you suppose you could cover all the tin cans there were in the world in the space of an hour or two? Yet here was spry little Daisy working at it day after day. Ah, but you see, you don't begin to realize how many tin cans there are in the world. When it comes to 500,000 being sent out from just one factory, then you are prepared to open your eyes wide and do some thinking. One of the trying features of this business was that it would persist in crowding itself into a few weeks of time, making everybody work day and night, as though work was all there could be of life, and then suddenly shutting down for a long winter, when the engine and the furnaces lay cold and still, and many of the busy workers found nothing to do. It was at this season of the year that Mrs. Bryant's ironing board came into service. For work as she would during the busy season to lay up for the winter, she found it a trying time. Harder than usual on this winter of which I write, because, in the very midst of the busiest season, Daisy herself had been taken sick, and lay very ill for days, and her mother had promptly turned away from the drying corn and wasting peaches, as though they were of the very smallest consequence, and hung over her little daughter day and night, and brought her through with good nursing, if ever a woman did, the doctor had said, as he drew on his gloves at that last visit. All this Daisy knew, as well as any of them, made this winter harder than any which had been since that one when the snow first fell on her father's grave. Ben had left school and gone into one of the stores as general errand boy, and sometimes clerk. When Daisy asked him if he had left school for good, he answered cheerily, "Why, of course, Daiselinda, I hope you did not think it was for bad." Then he had whistled a little, to keep a troublesome lump from rising in his throat. Line, too, had left school, and was doing the most of the work, that her mother might have all the more time for fine ironing. "It doesn't matter so much," Line had said cheerfully to her mother. "You see, we got so far behind during the busy season that we could not go on with our classes anyway, and Ben and I mean to study every evening and get ahead of the class by spring." And the mother had smiled and said, "I am blessed in my children." And they had all known that she cared very much. As for Daisy, she knew that Line cried once in a while, when she thought nobody saw her, and she knew that the doctor's bill was very long, so she thought a great deal during these days, and silently gave up some plans that she had hoped to begin to carry out. She was resolved that the others should not have all the sacrifice, for was she not 8 years old? Among other schemes which she quietly gave up, was that one of having a square of carpet with a border to it for the study. It had seemed to her that this would be beginning to be a little like Miss Sutherland's study. How much of a beginning it would really have been, you might perhaps realize more fully, could you take a careful look at the room which was Daisy's model. But Daisy realized fully that more carpet was quite out of the question this year. There had been another plan to have a motto for her study, and to have it by Thanksgiving morning. Not a lovely painted one, like Miss Sutherland's, which had been very lately sent to her, and was one of the first things Daisy had seen the other day while she waited for the change, but one worked on cardboard, such as she had seen in the stores, such as she knew she could buy for 10 cents, and the silks to work it for 5 cents more. But where are the 15 cents to come from? Daisy asked herself with an exceedingly thoughtful face. The more she thought, the more sure she was that the motto would have to be given up. She did not know that anyone understood her sacrifice, but there were more things understood in that house than Daisy dreamed of. Just the evening before Thanksgiving, the family were gathered in the study, Mother sewing as usual, Ben and Line studying, Daisy thinking. Suddenly she broke forth. "Mother, what are we going to be thankful for tomorrow?" "Thankful for?" repeated the mother in a mildly astonished tone, while Ben looked up from his book and whistled softly, and Line laughed. But Daisy held her ground. "Why, yes, oughtn't we to think up things and be ready? It isn't as though we had a great many, you know." "I think we have a great many, and I think thinking them up is a very good idea," said Mrs. Bryant, as she sewed and smiled. The whole family were taken up with the idea. Ben engaged to "do the example" in his notebook, and the list began. "You give the first one, Mother," Daisy said. "Well, in the first place, we are all well and all together." "4 healthy Bryants," wrote Ben with a flourish, only Daisy keeping her gravity the while. She was very much in earnest. "I am thankful for this history," said Line, hugging her second-hand book. "I thought I should have to make one of my own before I heard of this." And "one history old as the United States and good as new" went down on Ben's list. For his first item he wrote 50 cents a week, explaining that it stood for his promotion in the store, by which he earned just so much more a week. As for Daisy, she said promptly, "A chicken most as big as a turkey." "It isn't because I want so much," she explained with a little flush on her cheek, "but I like it to be big because it might almost be called a turkey, and I like the name turkey very much for Thanksgiving." It was intensely interesting work. More than one exclamation was made over the length of the list. "Mother," said Daisy, hesitating over her turn, "could you put down something that you hadn't got, and be thankful for that?" "Of course," said Ben, answering promptly. "Daisy Bryant hasn't the smallpox. Will that do?" "No, I don't mean that. I don't quite know how to tell what I do mean. But, Mother, if you might have had a thing, and wouldn't buy it because you thought it was not right to use the money for it, wouldn't it be a thing to be thankful for?" "It certainly would," said Mrs. Bryant decidedly. "A prudent mind, or an unselfish heart, is a great cause for gratitude." "Then, Ben, you may put down for me, saved 15 cents." Daisy drew a long sigh of relief, as though some important matter was settled. At this, mother and older daughter exchanged glances. They knew that Daisy's own tin bank contained just 15 cents, the sum of all her wealth, which had been accumulating for months and months. They knew just how she had been tempted to spend it, letting Sunday school money and benevolences of all sorts, to say nothing of household needs, go to the winds. Ben knew about it too, and he leaned over and kissed his little sister squarely on the nose before he made the record. But mother and older daughter also knew a delicious little secret, which made them smile at each other, although there was something in the mother's eyes that glistened. Presently Ben gave a short, sharp whistle. "See here," he said, "how am I ever to get the sum of all these things? People and books and chicken and house rent all mixed up together. It is compound addition with a vengeance. The things won't add." "Suppose you let me do the summing up," Mrs. Bryant said, as she took the notebook and wrote at the bottom of the page in her neat, plain fashion, "How precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand." End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Delicious Secret. The way Mrs. Bryant and Line had come to understand some of Daisy's wishes was in this fashion. Daisy, in one of her thoughtful hours, had asked, "Mother, what does troth mean?" "Troth?" repeated Ben, looking puzzled. "Don't you mean trough?" Daisy put down her head on her mother's arm to laugh before she answered. She knew what trough meant, and felt sure her word was very different. "Tell me how you have seen it used," said Mrs. Bryant, musing how best to explain the word to her 8-year-old daughter. "Why, in Miss Sutherland's study there is a motto hanging on the wall, a new one. It was not there last week. And it says on it in lovely gold and brown letters, 'Keep troth.'" "Oh," said Mrs. Bryant. "Why, Daisy, suppose you and somebody you love very much had promised each other some dear and pleasant thing, and your friend to keep you always reminded of your promise should buy or paint for you a motto with those words on it. If you understood the words, as often as you looked at them they would say to you, 'Be faithful to your pledge.'" Daisy's eyes were shining. "Why, Mother," she said, "I think that is lovely. Couldn't anybody think it was a motto from Jesus to remind us of our promises to him?" It was a very pleasant smile that Mrs. Bryant gave Daisy then. Her little daughter certainly had some choice thoughts. "I think anybody might," she said. "That is, if anybody thought of it." And she wondered how many who used the word thought of Jesus and the pledges he was willing to exchange with them. Silence for a few minutes. Ben had gone back to his arithmetic, but he was still thinking of the new word. Its meaning was certainly very different from that of trough. Presently Daisy, prefacing her words with a gentle little sigh which she often used, "I think mottos are lovely. They seem to belong to studies. They fit them a great deal better than pictures, I think. They say things to you, you know. Well, so do pictures, some of them, but I would just love to have a motto for our study. I could make a cardboard one if I had the cardboard, but they cost 10 cents apiece, and then there's the silk." The sentence closed with another little sigh. That was the first the family heard of the motto, but not the last. Daisy often spoke of it. She did not know she thought aloud so much. She did not dream that her pitiful little sacrifice, at last, of her dear plan, almost broke her mother's heart. Then Line went to thinking and planning, and the mother helped, and Ben helped, and on Thanksgiving morning what did Daisy's astonished eyes behold when she entered the study, but a motto in a lovely frame, hanging by a crimson cord, in just the right place on the wall. Peace and plenty were the words which smiled down on her. But there was more to the motto than this. It was decorated with leaves and flowers, and the centerpiece was a figure which Daisy promptly named an angel, scattering flowers or fruits or something over the land. It is true the lettering on this centerpiece spelled September, and the month was November. That word had been a trial to Line and Ben for a week. They had discussed and abandoned various plans for covering it. But Daisy, after she had exulted over every pretty thing about it, had hinted that she plainly saw the troublesome word, by saying, "Peace and plenty, those just exactly fit Thanksgiving, don't they? And how pretty that word September will be next fall, because, you know, mottos are for all the year round." At which both Line and Ben had laughed, as they kissed her, and Ben said she ought to be named Sunshine instead of Daisy. Where did the motto come from? Why, it was cut out of an old magazine that a boy in the store had given to Ben, and pasted on the cover of an old box, and covered neatly by Line with some white satin paper given her at the paper factory, and banded with gilt strips which came from the same place. As for the crimson cord, Mrs. Bryant had produced it from a packed-away box of long-ago treasures. "It used to belong to an old picture that has faded out now," she said with a smile which played around lips that quivered. and Line and Ben handled the cord tenderly and spoke low for the next few minutes. But what a joy that motto was to Daisy! "It is so true," she said, dancing about it gleefully, that Thanksgiving morning. "We are just as peaceful as we can be. Not a bit of trouble anywhere, have we, Mother? And as for plenty, you know the chicken is very big, and you know there are to be mashed potatoes, and baked sweet apples and milk, and the chicken is to be stuffed just like a turkey. I'm sure the motto fits." In fact, I don't suppose you can understand what the surprise was to Daisy, unless you love beauty as well as she did, and have as few things with which to gratify the taste. Moreover, the motto had a mission. It was suggestive. The walls of the little cottage were not lathed and plastered, were not even painted. Their weather-stained unsightliness had been among Daisy's trials. On that very afternoon, when the work was all done, the kitchen in exquisite order and deserted, and the family were gathered at leisure in the study, Mrs. Bryant having promised not to sew a stitch because it was Thanksgiving, Daisy, gazing at the beloved motto, exclaimed, "Mother, oh, Mother, why couldn't we cover the walls with pictures?" Mrs. Bryant laughed. "You dear little dreamer," she said. "Where do you suppose the pictures are to come from, and how much paste and time do you suppose it would take?" "Oh, but I don't mean all at once. Be a long, long time, you know, and take just a tiny teaspoonful of flour at a time. We could afford that, couldn't we? When we found a real pretty picture anywhere, paste it up in a nice place, and in a great many months the walls would be covered." It was impossible not to laugh at the bright face and dancing eyes, and there was something so funny about it to Line and Ben that they laughed loud and long. Mrs. Bryant was the first to recover voice. "It is a pretty thought," she said, "and I will certainly try to furnish the spoonful of flour for my share. But we have almost no chances for pictures, darling, and I'm afraid you will be old and gray before the walls are covered." "Well," said Daisy cheerily, "then I will put on my spectacles and sit down and enjoy them." But Daisy's ideas were not generally allowed to drop. She kept eagerly at hers until the others absorbed a little of her enthusiasm, and Mrs. Bryant confessed that she had a picture laid away in a box which she had kept for a long time. The box was brought out, and its contents turned over and enjoyed. It was a queer collection of old half-worn treasures: a shoe that belonged to the baby who died, the tiny waist of the first dress Line ever wore, a queer little tintype of Daisy herself when she was a wee baby. In it she had many fingers, because she would wiggle them. But the picture on which Daisy's fingers immediately pounced was one of a mother bending over an old-fashioned cradle in which lay a sleeping baby, while outside in the dooryard and in the distance, away up the hillside, many sheep and lambs were resting on the grass or frisking about in the sunshine. "What a lovely, lovely picture," Daisy said. "How very pretty it would be for Christmas. If we could only get it framed and hung by Christmas time, wouldn't it be splendid? We couldn't have it so nice as my beautiful Peace and Plenty picture, of course. But couldn't we make some kind of a frame, don't you think? There's the baby and the sheep, and there's one shepherd. It just fits. While shepherds watched their flocks by night, all seated on the ground, you know. Only he didn't have such a cradle, did he, Mother? Because you know it says, 'For his cradle was a manger, and his softest bed was hay.' Don't you believe, Line, we could fix it up?" Subjects were very much mixed in our little Daisy's mind, but she knew exactly what she meant. So did her listeners. She was so eager and happy and resolute that it was impossible not to enter into the spirit of the matter with her, and before the family went to bed on that Thanksgiving night, a wonderful frame had been planned, and the place selected for the Christmas picture to hang. But though Daisy Bryant's heart was so set on furnishing a study, She thought of other things beside books. Never a little girl of 8 who loved her Dolly better than Daisy did her Arabella Aurelia. Much of her thinking was done with this treasure in her arms, and between the pauses of her wisest remarks she frequently bent over and kissed her darling. You would like me to stop just here and describe that doll baby. Was it china or wax or just common cloth? That is one of the questions you know you want answered. Very well, I will tell you. It was neither cloth, nor china, nor yet wax, but just plain wood. A wooden dolly! You never heard of such a thing. How could its nose and eyes and ears be made? Were they carved or only painted? Alas, I shall have to admit the sorrowful fact. It had no eyes, nor ears, nor nose, nor even mouth, though I'm afraid it would have grieved its little mother to the heart to have had these defects talked about. The truth was that Arabella Aurelia was once the arm of that large old-fashioned rocker which I told you had become Mrs. Bryant's sewing chair. She wore, for every day, a neat dark calico apron of Mrs. Bryant's, and on full dress occasions, a ruffled white dress which had been Daisy's own until time had worn it into shabbiness, besides making it too short and too narrow for Daisy. But Arabella Aurelia was very thin, so the worn places on the waist folded in out of sight, and not having any arms of her own, the fact that there were no sleeves left to the dress did not trouble her at all. She really looked very nicely in it. Daisy loved her much, as I said, and kissed her often, but it became evident in the course of time that she had many thoughts about her. For instance, one evening when the child lay flat on her lap, and she was regarding it gravely, she said, "Mother, if I had a really truly baby, what do you suppose I'd name it?" "What do you mean, Daisy? A little sister or brother?" "Oh, no, I mean a doll baby, but a really one." "Why, I don't know. You would name it Arabella Aurelia after this one, wouldn't you?" Daisy shook her head emphatically. "Oh, no, Mother, I never should. I shouldn't like those names for a truly dolly." "Why, you know," she began again after a thoughtful pause, during which time she seemed to be trying to put into shape some ideas which puzzled her, "I don't know that I can explain it, but of course this is not a really doll baby. She hasn't any eyes nor mouth, and I have to make believe about her all the time." Daisy sank her voice almost to a whisper, apparently making believe that Arabella Aurelia could hear, and not wishing to hurt her feelings. "But if I had a real doll with all those things," which term covered the accidents of eyes, mouth, and other features, "why, I wouldn't name her such a sort of make-believe name. You know, Mother, you wouldn't like to name your own daughter Arabella Aurelia, now would you?" "I don't believe I should," said Mrs. Bryant, laughing, although there did seem something pitiful in the fact that the wooden dolly, beloved though she was, had, after all, so little genuineness about her, even to Daisy's imagination. "Well," said Daisy, with a quickly smothered sigh, "that is just the way I feel. If I had a truly dolly, I should want her named Mary or Caroline or Sarah, or some name which belongs." Whereupon she caught up Arabella Aurelia and covered her wooden face with kisses. "Wasn't that just too pitiful for anything?" Line said, after Daisy was sound asleep for the night. "To hear that mouse go on about that old wooden arm. Mother, I do wish we could get Daisy a truly dolly for Christmas." Mrs. Bryant sighed and sewed and shook her head. "We might make a body," she said, "if we could get a pattern, and we could make a suit of clothes for it at odd minutes, but I'm afraid we can't manage the head this year, Line. It is going to be close work, you know." Yes, Line knew it, and Ben knew it. He looked at the patches on his shoes, and at the place where more patches were needed, and shook his head and said nothing. He needed new shoes, but at that minute he felt willing to wear patched ones forever, if he could only get a truly dolly for Daisy. The little girl hugged her wooden one close and kissed it more rapturously, if possible, than ever, but put no more of her thoughts about it into words intended for the family. Yet what was in her heart found occasional vent in words murmured to Arabella Aurelia. "You are a dear good dolly, if you are made of wood," she sometimes said between tender kisses. "You never cry, and you never pull my hair, like some babies. To be sure you can't, because you have no arms nor mouth. But then I don't believe you would if you could." One morning she came from Miss Sutherland's with a package of soiled linen wrapped up in a half sheet of newspaper. Having disposed of the contents, she retired with her newspaper to the study, whither she always went to read, no matter what hour of the day it was. Here she sat long, reading at first, then, with hands folded in her lap, eyes on the floor, thinking. Mrs. Bryant, who was hurrying about preparing to take her collars and cuffs from their foamy bath, glanced at her occasionally, and wondered what was being planned. Presently came the earnest little voice, which very often had a wistful note in it that went to the mother's heart. "Mother, do you suppose somebody would want to name a dolly after me?" "I should think almost anybody might be glad to," Mrs. Bryant said, looking at the neat little figure in dark blue calico, with a ruffle at her throat. "My whole name, Daisy Isabel Bryant?" "Why not?" "Well, but it might not go well with her last name, the dolly's mother's name, you know." "And then again it might," said Mrs. Bryant, smiling now, in spite of her efforts to carry on her part of the conversation with becoming gravity. "What has put that idea into your mind?" "Why, I was thinking that it was almost Christmas time, and there would be a great many new dollies, and a great many names would have to be found for them, and I was thinking what if some very nice little girl should have a lovely dolly and name her after me, it would be almost like me having one." The sentence ended with a patient little sigh. It was some minutes before Mrs. Bryant could make any answer. Then she said, "That is a very nice thought, and as people generally make presents to their namesakes, perhaps during the winter you could make some pretty little thing for her to wear. For instance, I have something which I think would make her a hat. Do you know any little girls who are going to have new dollies?" Daisy's eyes had danced as she listened, but over this question she grew grave. "Yes'm," she said, "but I don't mean any of them. I should like my namesake to live in a house where there was a piano, and a room made of glass, all for flowers, and a study. Not like ours, you know, but a truly one. Well, ours is truly, what there is of it, because we do have books," she looked approvingly at the Bible, arithmetic, and history, "and we study there. But I mean a real large study, with rows and rows of books, and maps and history pictures, and oh, Mother, you know just what I mean, don't you? It seems as though I must have my namesake live in such a house as that." "But you don't know any little girls who live in such houses, darling." "No, ma'am. I wasn't thinking of any little girls whom I know. In this paper I brought home there are ever so many letters from girls and boys, some of them younger than I am. They write to the editor of the paper, and ask questions, and tell things. I was wondering if I couldn't write to him, and ask him to speak about it to the little girls who take his paper." Now, Daisy's writing was much crookeder than her thoughts generally were. Truth to tell, she did not like to write very well. The process was so much slower than thinking, and the lines were so determined to be crooked, that by the time the third one from the copy was written, it looked like this. Reader's Note. Illustration of a copy book. The first line is very straight and neat, the next 3 lines in a juvenile hand, progressively more and more crooked. End Reader's Note. As for Daisy, by the time the writing lesson was done, she looked utterly discouraged. Her mother had often wished that her little girl had some correspondent, that she might become interested in letter writing, but she had not expected any scheme like this. There were many difficulties in the way, and Daisy was particular as to the style of paper to be used, but she was, as usual, persevering. In the course of 2 or 3 days there was written, signed, and sealed the following letter. Dear Mr. Editor, I am a girl 8 years old. My hair is brown, so are my eyes. I have no dolly, only a wooden arm to the old rocking chair. It broke off and couldn't be mended, so we made a dolly of it. She is very nice. I love her dearly, but of course she has no mouth, nor eyes, nor anything of that kind. Her name is Arabella Aurelia. She had to be named kind of queerly, on account of being queer herself. But what I wanted to write to you about is to know if you would ask the little girls who take your paper if they would not be so kind, only one of them, of course, as to name a new Christmas dolly after me. My name is Daisy Isabel Bryant. I think that would be a pretty name for a dolly, only perhaps rather long, unless the last name was quite short. I suppose the Isabel might be left out, and have only Daisy Bryant, only I like Isabel very much. I would have named Arabella Aurelia after me, but I couldn't quite like to, on account of her not having eyes nor arms. I don't expect to have a new dolly myself ever, because there are a great many things to get first, and by the time they are all got, I suppose I shall be too old for dolls. So I thought I would ask this favor of your little girls. If it can be done, just as well as not, I would like my namesake to live in a house which has a study, where they keep a great many books, because I like books myself, and we have a beginning of a study ourselves in the front part of Mother's kitchen, only it has but 3 books in it yet. Our books were burned in the fire, but I am very fond of them, and I mean to have rows and rows of them some day. So I thought I'd like to have my namesake grow up among them. Mother thinks you probably won't print this letter because, in the first place, we don't take your paper, and in the second place it is too long. I mean the letter is, you know. But I couldn't make it any shorter and tell you the things you need to know, could I? And we don't take any paper at all, since my father died. And so if you will just please tell the little girls about it, maybe some of them will, and I thank you very much indeed. I am your true friend, Daisy Isabel Bryant. Over this letter there were many family councils, and, on the part of Line and Ben, more or less objections. But Mrs. Bryant was disposed to let her little girl have her own way in the matter. So at last the letter was addressed and stamped and dropped in the post-box. "That is the last you'll hear of that," said skeptical Ben. "Oh, I don't know," said faithful Daisy. "I can think about a dolly who is perhaps my namesake, and when I'm a grown-up woman I may meet her. I should love her all the same, even if it didn't happen until I was 20 years old." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Aren't Things Queer? The study in which Judge Dunmore sat reading would certainly have satisfied Daisy Bryant's book-loving heart. Rows and rows and rows of books. In open bookcases and in closed bookcases, reaching to the ceiling and reaching to the floor. Then there was an elegant study table, and a white, old-fashioned lounge, with cushiony arms, where little Dee Dunmore often curled herself for an afternoon nap. Oh, it was a delightful room. On the evening of which I write, the family were gathered in it, and work was going on which would have relieved Daisy's mind. Mrs. Dunmore had her sewing, and Miss Edith was crocheting a new style of fascinator. Certainly if sewing and crocheting could venture into this study, Daisy need worry no more about her mother's work-basket. At a side table, under a drop light, the only student the room now contained, a young fellow of perhaps 14 or 15, bent over his Latin grammar. Little Miss D sat almost in the center of the room, caressing a new dolly. It still lacked nearly a week of Christmas, but the dolly had arrived by express from an auntie in Paris, and of course could not be left packed all that time. Judge Dunmore was reading the evening paper. Presently he looked up and sent his eyes in search of D. "Is that dolly named yet, daughter?" "No, sir, we can't decide on a name. Edith wants her to be named D after me, but I don't quite want two D. Dunmores in the same family. Edith wants it because she likes A pause and a slightly added flush on her cheeks over the unusual word, then the little woman went boldly on, "Littershun." A shout of laughter followed, but Mrs. Dunmore made haste to say, "Alliteration, dear. You had it right, all but the beginning, and a little letter in the middle." "Well, here is a chance for you, Littershun and all. My son, will you excuse the interruption while I read aloud a short letter?" Whereupon he read Daisy Bryant's letter to the editor quite through. Something was the matter with his glasses by the time he had finished. He took them off and gave them a vigorous rubbing. "Poor little thing," said Mrs. Dunmore, and her voice trembled. "It is a lovely name," Edith said. "Daisy Isabel Bryant. D, that's the very name for your dolly. Daisy Isabel Bryant Dunmore. Nothing could be more elegant. If I were you, I would write to her at once, and tell her all about the dolly, and describe the study. The number of books would suit her, I think." "I shouldn't wonder if she would make a good little correspondent," Judge Dunmore said. "The editor has given us a facsimile of her letter. The writing is rather crooked, but the spelling is perfectly correct, and the ideas are certainly well expressed." "It is very pathetic, I think," said Mrs. Dunmore. Amid all this talk, Dee sat with her arms clasped tightly around her dolly, her eyes meantime looking into space. Dee was doing some very grave thinking on her own account. Suddenly she burst forth, "That child ought to have a new dolly of her own. The idea of her having nothing but an old wooden arm of a chair to love and kiss and put to bed. Oh, dear me, Papa, couldn't we send her a dolly for Christmas?" "I really don't know, daughter. Could we? How much are you willing to give toward it?" This was bringing philanthropy down to a fine point. Miss D had her own small purse, and was required to supply herself with certain cheap necessaries, such as lead pencils, pens, pins, and the like, and was rigidly held to cash accounts and monthly settlements. She looked very sober over her father's question. Her mother tried to relieve her anxiety. "A neat little dolly such as the child would consider a treasure would cost but a trifle. $1 ought to buy one." A quick, resolute shake of her head came from Dee. "Oh, no, Mamma, if you please, I shouldn't like that at all. My dolly is so lovely, I wouldn't want to have such a great difference between them. A little girl who could plan about a study and all those things would know what a truly nice dolly was. Don't you think so?" "Oh, I haven't a doubt of it. But could you afford an expensive dolly just now, dear?" Dee looked troubled again. "Why, I could help," she said. "It is so near to Christmas time that I am rather poor, but I think— wouldn't you help buy it, dear mamma? It is benevolence, you know." "How can you prove that, Dee?" It was the judge who spoke now. "A dolly is a sort of luxury, you see, and to give luxuries to the poor is not benevolence, is it?" "Oh, no, indeed, papa. A dolly is not a luxury. It is a necessity. That is, in houses where there are no real babies. Of course, I would rather have a little brother or sister 100 times, but I haven't, you know, and this Daisy hasn't, of course, or she would say so. And, papa, a little girl couldn't go to sleep without a dolly. She couldn't, really. And besides, Mama says my dolly helps me to learn to sew and to care for clothing and plan what is needed in different seasons. It helps you in a good many ways, doesn't it, Mama?" Judge Dunmore laughed. "Very well argued," he said. "You have won your case. As soon as I learn what your desires are, and how much you propose to give towards it yourself, I will add my contribution." "Well, Papa, you know I said I was poor, and I cannot do much. But there is a lovely dolly in Mrs. Streeter's store, and she is good, Mrs. Streeter is. I think she will let us have it for what it cost her. She told me it cost her $5. That would be just the same as her giving something towards it, you know. I have only 25 cents, though, of my own to give, and that's dreadful little. Do you think we could raise $5, Papa?" "Try it," said Judge Dunmore. "Let us see how good an operator you are. I will give $1 towards it." "Oh, Papa, that's a nice beginning. Mama, how much will you help?" "Aren't Papa and I one?" Mrs. Dunmore asked, smiling. Dee was ready with her answer. "If you are, Mama, you ought to do exactly what Papa does, I should think." There was a sound of clapping of hands from the judge's corner, and amid much laughing, Mrs. Dunmore declared this logic was overpowering, and she might be counted on for $1. Then Edith and the young student were assailed, and after some bantering, agreed to 50 cents each. "It is getting on beautifully," Dee said. Her doll laid flat on the floor, while her mistress counted her chubby fingers to make sure of the result. "I know we shall get it all, but I'm sorry my part is so small. I wanted to ask her to name her dolly for me, but I don't like to give only 25 cents." "I could put you in the way of making it $1 if you chose," said Mrs. Dunmore quietly. "Oh, Mama, how? Wouldn't that be just lovely?" "The difference between the buttons you chose for your suit and the ones I said would answer is just 75 cents." Dee looked grave and businesslike. "But that wouldn't be my money, Mama?" "Oh, you may do what you please with the 75 cents. I gave you permission to select the buttons, and you have done so. If you choose now to take cheaper ones, the money thus saved becomes yours." Dee clasped and unclasped her hands thoughtfully. "Mama, those buttons were very ugly. They didn't shine a bit." "They were not so pretty as the more expensive ones, of course, but they are neat and appropriate." Silence and perplexity on the part of one, then a long-drawn sigh as she stooped to pick up her dolly. "I hate dull buttons, and I don't believe I ever quite like things that are only appropriate. If I hadn't bought that blue satin cushion and that queer-shaped little box which broke as soon as I got home, I needn't do it, but I'm going to. You can order the dull buttons, Mama, and give me the 75 cents. But won't I be the only one who has made a sacrifice?" "No, indeed," declared Miss Edith. "It was a very great sacrifice for me to give 50 cents. I had at least 50 ways of spending it. And as for Max, he is always poor, aren't you, Max?" "I am," said the student, "but I am a great admirer of Daisy Isabel Bryant." "Besides," said the mother, "you ought to be the one to sacrifice if it is to be done. This is your scheme, you know. But what about the other $1? "I can get it easily enough," said Dee, nodding her head in an assured way. "There's Grandma. I don't feel the least bit in the world afraid but that she'll give it. Now, if Mrs. Streeter will do her part, we are all right. I'm going to name my dolly after her. I'll write and tell her so. And I mean to ask her to write letters to me. May I, Papa?" "I don't know, daughter. Mrs. Streeter seems to me a strange name to call a doll, and I should think you would prefer conversing with her rather than correspondence." "Oh, why, Papa, Papa, don't you know I mean the little girl?" "You didn't say so, my dear. Now I have a little plan, if yours is arranged to your mind. It is easy to read between the lines in that little girl's letter, though she didn't intend it. There are other than dolls' wardrobes needed there, I imagine. What if we should put the dolly in Mrs. Strader's window, dressed ready for traveling, hang a purse on her arm, and pin the little girl's letter to her dress, to tell its story? Wouldn't that be suggestive enough, Mamma?" Mrs. Dunmore agreed that it would certainly be very suggestive, and expressed her willingness to put some money in the purse. As for Dee, she went into a perfect ecstasy of delight, half smothering her papa with kisses, as a reward for his beautiful thought. Being an energetic little woman, she lost no time, and by 11 o'clock of the following morning, both Grandma and Mrs. Strader having been found gracious, the extra $1 was secured, the dolly bought, and stood in a conspicuous center of Mrs. Strader's show window. That she was a lovely dolly, dressed in the perfection of modern style, no one could gainsay. Her elegant hat was a contribution from Miss Edith Dunmore, who stayed from the morning concert at Corning Hall to get it ready for my lady's first appearance. Truth compels me to tell that she found the feather in a box of castaway finery which had been made ready for the ragman, but when it was steamed and curled with a dull-edged knife, it really looked elegant. Moreover, Miss Edith, getting deeper and deeper into the spirit of the thing, summoned her young friends with their castaway boxes that very afternoon, and out of bits of ribbon and velvet and lace and silk and skill manufactured such a toilet as any fashionable young lady, the size of this one, might admire. Meantime, in the show window, Miss D. Dunmore Bryant did her pretty work. When Judge Dunmore called, he selected a strong and pretty purse and had it fastened to the ribbons of her jacket, and a streamer of white ribbon was attached to her hat, on which was printed, "Stop and read my story." In her hand was placed Daisy Bryant's printed letter, with a few added lines of explanation, which the judge himself had written. It was pretty to see how interested the people were in that show window. It seemed as though almost everybody who came that way paused, smiling at the lovely face and curious streamer, read, smiled again, stepped inside, and gently took from her pretty kid hand the story, read it, asked questions of Mrs. Strader, then, still smiling, though some of them had almost tears in their eyes, dropped their offering into the purse and went their way. No, I am wrong. Some of them lingered for more than that. They found Mrs. Strader polite and attentive. They found she had many useful and pretty things for sale, and sold them at reasonable prices. Some of them discovered that she was a widow, that she was bravely trying to support herself and 3 children by means of this neat and well-kept store, that she belonged to the same church with themselves, and that, though they had never thought of it before, she certainly ought to have some of their patronage. "That was a good thought of yours, my dear," said Mrs. Strader to Dee, when, on the evening of that first eventful day, she called to see how her namesake was prospering. "I hope you will have more like it come into your pretty head. I don't know how much money has been dropped into the purse, but I know I have had to empty it 3 times into that strong locked box on the shelf there to make room for more. And I know I never sold so many things in one day before. People come in to see Miss Dolly, and see something that they like, and buy it. People who have never been inside my store before, Miss D. And more than that, some of them promise to be good customers of mine after this. I can well afford to let you have the dolly for just what I paid for it, and I'll add some things to the box she travels in, see if I don't. I laid awake nights bemoaning my folly in buying so expensive a dolly for my modest little store, and told myself a dozen times a night that I would never get my money back. And here it is the most useful person who ever looked out of my store window. I'll not forget the little lady, nor the one who named her." "It is papa's thought, Mrs. Strader," said truthful Dee. "I thought about buying the dolly, but I never could have planned anything so nice as sending a present with her. Papa did every bit of that. He is a lawyer, you know, and lawyers always think of things." To her mother, Dee said, "Aren't things queer, Mamma? You can't do the least little bit of good to anybody without doing good to a lot of other people. There's our dolly and Mrs. Strader. She says this is going to make her a happy new year, because it will make her square with the old year. She means she will not be in debt. Mamma, I didn't understand about being square, so I asked her. And Grandma says giving that $1 for the dolly made her think about those things she has had laid away so long to give to somebody, and she sent a bundle to old Mrs. Barnes this very day. And Papa says when he looked at her little pink and white face, the dolly's, I mean, it made him think of that little bit of a girl who lives over the wagon shop, and he sent her father a cart full of things for Christmas, because he is sick, you know, and can't earn them. Aren't things real mixed up and queer?" "No man liveth to himself," quoted the judge, who was in the library and overheard the talk. That was what the little one means, though she doesn't know how to express it. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. D. Dunmore Bryant. In Mrs. Bryant's kitchen everything was in beautiful order, though it was still quite early. The household had been astir since long before daylight, Daisy finding it impossible to sleep, and her mother silently determining that a quart of oil should be sacrificed if necessary, so that her little daughter might have the full benefit of the Christmas day. It was a household in which kerosene oil, as well as everything else, was used most economically. But Christmas came but once a year, and Daisy would never be just 8 years old again, so the lamp was lighted before 6 o'clock. The excitement of examining the stocking that hung all alone by the chimney corner was well over, and an intense excitement it had been. Almost everything in it had been a surprise to the little girl. Some of the things would not go into the stocking at all, but hung in delightfully bulgy and mysterious packages, outside, with a cord attached to them, and pinned to the red stocking. For instance, Ben had, with a little help from the friendly carpenter around the corner, made for her the most complete little set of bookshelves that Daisy had ever seen. She felt certain there were none nicer in the world, and she may be sure that none were ever made with more painstaking care. 3 shelves, beautifully smooth, and stained to look like the solid black walnut of Miss Sutherland's bookcases. They were already hung, the 3 books placed upon them, and continually Daisy's eyes roved to that choice corner, and her heart gave strong little beats of happiness. Over the bookcase, as Daisy assured them the shelves must be called, were hanging the Christmas pictures in their gay frames. On the upper shelf were arranged with great care certain smaller treasures from the stocking, a pretty heart-shaped pin-cushion from Mother, stuck full of pins of different sizes, a neat little box covered with gay pictures and lined with pink cloth to make it strong enough for the 3 spools and the speck of a needle-book, with 5 needles placed in shining rows on the bit of fine notched flannel inside. There had been intense excitement over that box, for, in addition to the spools and the needle-book, gifts from Mother, there had gleamed before Daisy's astonished eyes a real truly silver thimble, of just the right size for her small finger. Miss Sutherland had called one morning with some collars and cuffs that she was in haste to have laundried, and had found Mrs. Bryant busy lining the box, taking advantage of Daisy's having been sent downtown on errands. Miss Sutherland had admired the pink lining and the bright pictures, and had asked several questions, and the night before Christmas had come this bit of a thimble, together with a box of choice grapes for Line, and a basket of apples for Ben. But the crowning delight of Daisy's heart had been the united gift of Mother, Line, and Ben. This was nothing less wonderful than a bright patchwork curtain, some of the patches of silk and some of bright soft wools, and being hung on a strong red cord that Ben had bought with the last cent he had in the world, it was long enough and wide enough to curtain off the study, so that, on occasion, it could be entirely separated from the kitchen. Could anything ever be nicer than that? It was hard for Daisy to believe that she could ever be happier or more grateful than she was this morning. Truth to tell, I don't suppose she ever will be. With all these wonders to admire and talk over, for to each belonged half a dozen separate stories, it had been hard work to eat any breakfast, though they had bread cakes and syrup, as well as baked potatoes. "We'll be downright extravagant for once," said Line, "and have cakes and baked potatoes and apple sauce, and we are going to have a chicken again for dinner, larger than the one we had on Thanksgiving Day, I do believe. I tell you what, Daisy Bryant, it isn't every little girl who has such a time made over her being 8 years old." Daisy fully believed this, and was happy. Now at 10 o'clock, with the kitchen in perfect order, with the delicious smell of roasting chicken already in the air, with the curtain drawn before the lovely little study, Daisy sat in her own low chair, her wooden dolly on her lap, and looked about her with satisfied smiles on her face. "Are you perfectly contented?" her mother asked, smiling on her, as she stopped on her way to the oven door to peep into the study and see what was going on. "Yes'm, well, no, ma'am, not quite," said Daisy, with a little shamefaced laugh. "I did think that maybe there would be some little girl write me a Christmas letter to tell me that she had named her dolly for me, but Ben went to the office, you know, when he took the apple basket home, and there wasn't anything." "Perhaps it will come tomorrow," said her mother soothingly, "or tonight, but I wouldn't expect it too much if I were you. This is a very busy world, and little girls don't write many letters. I think it more than likely that the little girl who named her new dolly for you meant to write you and tell you about it, but she will keep putting it off, until by and by she will think it is too late." "Then you think there is a dolly named for me?" said Daisy with a bright face. "Oh, I haven't a doubt of it," said Mrs. Bryant, as she went in some haste toward the stove, for the apple sauce was sputtering as though it meant to boil over in less than another minute. It was just then that Daisy heard an emphatic knock at the back door. She sat still and listened, for her mother's quick step moved toward the door. Then she heard the following remarkable conversation. "Good morning, ma'am. Have you a party stopping with you by the name of D. Dunmore Bryant?" "D. Dunmore Bryant?" repeated Mrs. Bryant wonderingly. "No, I don't know that name at all. There is no one stopping here but my own family." "Well, this trunk is sent to your care or to little Miss Daisy's. The card reads plainly enough. In fact, it's print. Miss D. Dunmore Bryant, care of Miss Daisy Isabel Bryant. I kind of thought I'd like to see Miss D. Dunmore if she was here, for judging from this trunk, I thought she must be about the size of my thumb." With a broad smile on his face, the village expressman stepped forward and landed in the middle of the little kitchen a trunk about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and perhaps a little more than a foot high. A perfect trunk, studded with brass nails, and locked and strapped in the most business-like manner. "Came by express, ma'am," said the man, his face seeming to grow broader while he looked first at Mrs. Bryant, then at the trunk. "I only hope Miss D. Dunmore isn't done up inside of it, for it is a well-made little thing, and there wouldn't be much chance for air inside." By this time Daisy was in the kitchen, her eyes very large. There was certainly her name in neat print on the end of the dear little trunk. But who in the world was Miss D. Dunmore Bryant, and how should they find her and let her know that they had her trunk? This was the question which troubled the Bryant household for some time. The expressman, who was a friend of Ben's, and who liked to do a good turn for his friends, went away laughing, declaring that there was nothing to pay, or at least if there was, he would wait until Miss D. Dunmore Bryant put in an appearance before he presented his bill. For if she could get all her furbelows into a trunk of that size, he would be mighty well to see her. "I would open the thing," declared Ben, when he had come home and walked around it, and lifted it on his shoulder to try its weight, and wondered and studied as much as the others. "It is sent to Daisy's care, and it's our own name, and she doesn't know how to take care of it without knowing what is inside. Halloo, look here! Tucked under this strap is the mite of a key tied on with a cord. They mean you shall open it and take care of the things. They may be flowers or something that will spoil. Wouldn't you open it, Mother?" "I believe I would," said Mrs. Bryant, who began to have a theory of her own to the effect that Miss D. Dunmore might really be inside. But she kept her own counsel and looked on, while Ben, with nervous haste, unstrapped the wee trunk, and Daisy, her fingers trembling so that she could hardly do it, turned the key and threw up the lid. A complete trunk inside as well as out, fitted up in compartments, hat box, shoe box, toilet box, everything complete, all carefully closed and fastened down. On the very top, however, was a letter addressed in a round hand to Miss Daisy Isabel Bryant. "Hurrah!" said Ben. "Here is a letter for you, Daiselinda. Now we will understand this mystery." "Shut down the lid of the trunk," said her thoughtful and far-seeing mother, "and let Daisy read the letter before we go any farther. Then if it is her duty to unpack the trunk, she can have the pleasure of doing it herself." So Daisy broke the seal and read aloud. "My dear friend, Daisy Isabel Bryant. Mother, who can it be from? I have no friend to write to me." "I don't know, dear. Perhaps it is someone who has written in answer to the letter you sent to the paper." "Read on," said Line. "Then you will find out who it is." "Yes, hurry up," said Ben. "We can't stand such suspense as this very long." And as he spoke his eyes danced with pleasure. He had caught a gleam of his mother's thought. What a thing it would be if somebody had really sent Daisy a dolly! And Daisy read, "I am D. Dunmore," exclamations of astonishment and pleasure from the listeners. "A little girl pretty near 9 years old. At least I was 8 almost 3 months ago. Papa read your letter in the paper aloud to us, and as I had a new dolly come from Paris only a few weeks ago, and she hadn't any name, I named her for you right away. She is lovely. I have sent you her picture so that you can see for yourself. I sent mine too, because I had none of Dolly without me, and besides, I thought maybe you might like to see me too. I am going to be your friend, you know, and to write letters to you if you will answer them. I don't write very well yet, but I am learning. Then I thought it was kind of lonesome to have only a dolly who had no mouth, nor eyes, nor any of those things. I don't mean that she isn't nice, and I know you love her, because sometimes Mamma rolls up a pillow for me for a dolly, and I find I love it very much. But then I couldn't get along with only that kind of a dolly, and I thought I ought to have a namesake too. So we made up our minds to send you one named after me, and she is in the trunk, and we hope you will like her." "Oh, Mother!" said Daisy, stopping for breath, and almost ready to cry in her surprise and delight. "Oh, Mother, do you think there is a real truly dolly for me in this trunk?" "I begin to think so," said Mrs. Bryant, and she turned away just then to look at the chicken in the oven, and wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Go ahead," said Ben, and Daisy read, "Mamma helped, and Papa, and Grandma, and all of them. Mrs. Strader did too, so it is a present from all of us. Sister Edith and her friend made the clothes, and I really think the hat is lovely. The plume is a piece of one that my auntie sent from Paris. The purse on her arm is not Dee's, but yours. Papa sent it with his love, and he says the things in it are from your friends who feel sure that you will make good use of them. He says ever so many friends helped send them to you. that it is a trifle from each in memory of the Christmas time, and the dear Saviour who said it was more blessed to give than to receive. And you are to give our regards to your mother, and tell her we hope she will let you accept these gifts for His sake. Those are Papa's very words. I had a great time writing them. I had to keep asking him over and over what came next. It took me almost all day to write this letter, and I had to copy it twice. Once I blotted dreadfully, and once I got it all mixed up. It doesn't take me so long when I write just my own words, because I pick out the little bits of ones. I like to speak long words pretty well, but it is a good deal of trouble to write them. They have so many letters, you see. Well, I hope you will love D. Dunmore, and I am sure you will. I hope you will like the name. I like Daisy Isabella very much indeed. I never had a dolly in my life whose name I liked so well. Oh, I forgot to tell you that the dress in the bottom of the trunk is too large for D, and too small for me, and Mamma thought it possible it might fit you. She says if it doesn't, your mamma will know some little girl to give it to. Now I wish you Merry Christmas, and I hope you will write to me. Good-bye. D. Dunmore. Well, of all things in this world, said Ben, the minute the letter was finished, though what all things in this world had to do with it he did not explain. As for Daisy, she sat like one stunned, staring at the letter in her lap. Why don't you open the trunk, dear, and give Dee a breath of fresh air? Mother, said Daisy, doesn't it seem almost too wonderful some way? Then she dived forward and raised the lid, and amid little squeals of delight and exclamations of rapture, Miss D. was drawn out from her wrappings, and stood before them, smiling lips, blue eyes, curly hair, and all. Could I describe her, do you think, or her wardrobe for that matter? It was, without doubt, the most elegant one that was ever unpacked in that little village. Do look at the silk dresses, said Line. Miss Sutherland's wardrobe sinks into insignificance beside this one. The purse had slipped from her delicate hand and lay just at her side, and was heavy. Ben took it in hand, and his face grew first red, then pale, as he said at last almost under his breath, Mother, there are $50 in that purse. What does it all mean? But Daisy had forgotten the purse and its contents. She was rapturously kissing the picture of a sweet-faced little girl with a dolly in her arms. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. D. Dunmore's Rivals. What does it all mean? Asked Ben at last, his usually cheery face clouded over. I don't understand it, Mother. We may be poor, but we are surely not objects of charity. This isn't charity, my boy, said Mrs. Bryant, with her brightest smile. This is grace. Then, seeing that Ben's face did not brighten, she added, speaking very kindly, but with a good deal of decision, Ben, dear, don't allow yourself to be above receiving kindly and cordial lifts in this world from your brothers and sisters. These are not strangers, they belong to our Father's family. We did not appeal to them for a Christmas gift, but our Father knows perfectly well that we are in closer quarters than usual this winter, and, while I had not reached the point of asking any one but Him, I am more than thankful that He has put it into the hearts of some of our brothers and sisters to give us a lift towards the rent and the new stove, which seems almost a necessity. It seems just like beggars, said Ben, and his voice was almost scornful. Why, none of us begged, my boy, though I hope our pride would not be above even that if it should be plainly shown that it was our duty. Look here, mother's boy, the feeling you are nursing now is beneath you. It looks just enough like real honest virtue for Satan to succeed in deceiving you. And I have no doubt he is very much tickled this minute about having done so. To go about asking for help, or even to be willing to receive help that is unnecessary, is to have a mean nature. But, on the other hand, to be above refusing a heartily offered and kindly meant lift when one is really in need, shows a mean nature also. You will never be mean in one direction, Ben, and if I were you, I would see to it that Satan didn't outwit me at the other end of the line." "Well, but mother," here interposed Line, "it is so queer and strange to have such a thing happen to us. Who ever heard of a lot of strangers starting up and sending money to people whom they didn't know at all, and who didn't ask for any of their help?" "It is strange," mused Mrs. Bryant, "when you talk about a lot of strangers, but when one thinks of father and the other children of the family, it isn't so strange after all. It is just like him." Line laughed a little, and yet her laugh had almost a note of awe in it. Her mother's way of speaking about God was always wonderful and rather bewildering both to Ben and Line. Ben's face was clearing. He did not fully understand his mother, but he had great faith in her, and sense enough to see that her dignity was superior to his. He did not want to be mean, certainly. It was a new idea to him that it was possible for a person to be too small of nature to receive gifts graciously. As for Daisy, she was still so absorbed in loving Miss D. Dunmore that she took no part in this conversation, and indeed did not give it her usual attention. One sentence, however, had attracted her, and she gave over kissing D. Dunmore, and looked thoughtfully at her mother for a full minute, before she asked her grave question. "Mother, are we in need?" "Yes," said Ben, "that's the question." Mrs. Bryant was still for so long that Line looked at her in surprise, then gave Ben a half-reproachful glance, as much as to say, "See how you've made her feel with your questionings." "Children," said Mrs. Bryant, and her voice trembled a little despite her effort to control it, "Mother doesn't tell you all her cares, because you are too young yet to bear their weight. But now that the blessed Father in heaven has come to us in so wonderful a way, perhaps you ought to know that there are a few debts, in spite of all I could do, pressing upon us. One in particular that I could see no way of meeting. It has troubled me night and day for weeks, though I have not let any of you know about it, because I knew you were doing all you could now, and it seemed hard to give you any more burdens to think about. A few nights ago I was able to leave it in the hands of our Father, and to say to him that I was willing to trust to his way of leading me, though it should be quite in the dark. And it did seem dark, I can tell you. I puzzled my head all one night, trying to think of ways in which help might come, but I never thought of this one." "Mother," said Ben, his voice grave and respectful, "I did not understand. I mean, I did not know you had a trouble." Before Mrs. Bryant could open her lips to reply to this, something else astonishing happened. Another knock at the door, and another box on the steps. 2 of them, indeed, both directed very plainly to Daisy Isabel Bryant. "What in the world?" said Ben, and then fell to work with hammer and axe to find out. Daisy, pale with excitement, laid D. Dunmore down very carefully, and came herself to lift the soft cotton from whatever precious thing lay underneath it. Another dolly! The loveliest little old-fashioned darling! Dressed in a round waist of rich embroidery, with a full baby skirt and a broad embroidered collar and cuffs; with real hair on her head, and real shoes on her feet, and a card in her pretty hand which read, "I am Nellie May, and I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I've come to live with you." "Mother," said Daisy, her lips fairly trembling. "Oh, mother!" But that was just as much as the lips were capable of doing. "Hold on," said Ben. "There's more things in this box. A whole raft of dresses and things, I suppose. No, as true as my name is Benjamin Foster Bryant, there's another doll." Sure enough, a lovely little woman in a long Newmarket buttoned to her toes, and a charming little storm hood out of which the sweetest face peeped, as Daisy bent forward to make out the name. From Alice Castleton to Daisy Isabel Bryant, with happy New Year wishes. There were many other things in that box. A whole raft of dresses and things, as Ben had said. Also a cunning little bedstead, all made up, ready for Nellie May to sleep on, and a set of china dishes for her refreshments. So eager were they all in their admiring examination of the pretty things that they almost forgot there was another box. Ben, being a boy, was ready for it first, but declared that he could tell before opening what was in it. There was another doll, of course. "Oh, no!" Daisy said, but her cheeks were very red again, and she came over to get the first peep when the cover was lifted. The fair baby who met her gaze, asleep on her little bed, with one chubby arm thrown back of her head and one foot doubled under her, looked so much like life that for a minute all four, after the first breathless examination from Daisy, stood and looked, saying nothing. At last Ben was equal to his favorite and most expressive remark. "Well, I never!" Then they fell to unpacking. The baby was found to open its eyes as soon as it was stood on its feet. It also had brought its bed along, and a supply of lovely white slips, Mrs. Bryant called them, and was "Little Emmeline from New York." So a card under the pillow declared. To undertake to describe the Bryant family for the remainder of that day would be a task quite beyond my powers. Line declared she was but 6 years old, she was sure, and wanted to do nothing but dress and undress dollies. And Mrs. Bryant said she did not wonder. It was enough to make even her into a child again, to see such an array of lovely dollies. But if they said this at 11 o'clock, what do you think they said by 7 that evening? When the afternoon express came in, no less than 5 boxes were brought to the little brown house, each of them addressed to Miss Daisy Isabel Bryant, and each containing a dolly. With the 5 o'clock train there came 7 more boxes, and by 6 the little study was literally overflowing with children, sitting on the new shelves, standing in rows against the walls, or lying on their own little beds. One of the cunningest was named "The Little Girl Who Will Not Be Dressed." Sure enough, a little barefooted darling, with her hair in her eyes and her hands spread out, and for clothing only a short striped skirt with straps over her shoulders. When Line stood her against the wall, she declared that she looked for all the world like the rogue who was visiting at Dr. Priestley's, and who always ran away, the nurse said, before he was dressed in the morning. But excitement, though very great, did not really reach white heat until a box larger than the others was opened, and found to contain a very remarkable family, 5 in number. 2 great rag dolls with woolly heads and thick red lips and white eyes, dressed in the brightest colors imaginable, and 3 sweet-faced, charmingly dressed dollies, exhibiting every variety of costume. The card which accompanied them read, "The Misses Cecilia Rosamond and Gabrielle Rushington and their 2 maids, Topsy and Tursey, who have all come to live with Daisy Isabel Bryant, and bring with them the love and good wishes of the 4 little Cushman girls who live in Atlanta." What a pity I could not show you pictures of all those dollies! What a pity I could not photograph that study for you when they were all arranged for the night! 35 dolls in dignified rows around that astonished little room. Daisy had arranged and rearranged, with the help of her mother and Line. Even Ben lent a hand when the family grew too numerous for management without him. "Talk about the old woman who lived in her shoe," he said to Daisy, poising one of the late-comers, named Greta from over the seas, on the palm of his hand as he made careful scrutiny of the shoes she wore. "Why, she was nothing compared to you. What in the world will be done with them all? I'll have to build you an orphan asylum." "No," said Daisy, stopping short in the midst of her anxious putting of the baby to bed, arranging her little arms in the same sweet way they were when she arrived. "Don't say that, Ben. They are not orphans. I am their mother." Whereupon Ben burst into the loudest laugh the little house had heard that day. "If she isn't ready to mother every one of them," he said. "Why, Daisy, do you mean to say you are going to adopt even this little Dutch party? She hasn't been over from Germany a month, if she has a week. She is Dutch from her plastered down hair to her queer looking feet." Daisy laid the baby down hastily, and came over to Ben, in her eyes a reproachful look. "Give her to me," she said with dignity. "I don't like her made fun of, I don't really. Seems as if she could understand. I like her if she is Dutch. She cannot help not being as pretty as the others, but I shall love her all the same." With a good deal of effort Ben checked the laugh that wanted to peal forth again. It was too queer, but Daisy was in as evident earnest as she had ever been in her life. She had opened her heart and taken in the whole company, Dutch girl, colored maids, and all. "She is the queerest little mixture of baby and grown-up woman I ever saw in my life," he said, when Daisy was at last tucked away for the night, so worn out from the unusual excitement that her mother could not help feeling a little anxious about her. "Sometimes she has such wise thoughts that it seems as though she must be a great deal older than she is, and sometimes she is just a baby herself." "You ought to go and look at her now, Ben," said Line. "She is sound asleep with D. Dunmore in her arms, and Nellie Mae's bedstead close beside her crib. And the Dutch girl you laughed at lies with her square head on the other pillow. She said she would have to hold D in her arms, because she began to love her first, and could not help wanting her real close. But she was never going to let that Dutch dolly suppose that because she was so fleshy, and her clothes were not so pretty as the others, she did not think a great deal of her. Daisy is too funny for anything." "You don't either of you know where Arabella Aurelia is," said Mrs. Bryant. "Come with me and I'll show you." So they all tiptoed in to see. Mrs. Bryant turned down the sheet with careful hand, and there was Arabella Aurelia, the beloved armchair dolly, lying flat upon her mother's bosom, closer even than D. Dunmore, with all her beauty. "She asked me," said Mrs. Bryant, when they had tiptoed back again, "whether if I had had a prettier little girl than she come to live with me, I would give her her place." "I'd like to see you find a prettier girl," said Ben with energy. Then after a moment, "Mother, what in the world will she do with all those dolls?" "I'm sure I don't know," his mother said. Then the Bryant family looked at one another and laughed. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. If I Only Had. Around the corner, but a short walk from Mrs. Bryant's little cottage, lived a family whose young people were quite intimate friends of Ben and Line Bryant. Not that they were in the least like them, unless the likeness could be found in the fact that both mothers were widows and were working hard to take care of their children. To Mrs. Bryant it seemed as if Mrs. Kedwin's life was much harder than hers. It is true, Mrs. Kedwin had 3 sons, while she had only 1. But then Mrs. Kedwin's oldest son was gone to sea. They had not even heard from him in more than a year, and the second boy was wild and hard. Was not her own Ben worth a dozen such boys as that? Mrs. Kedwin lived in a larger house than she, much larger in fact, and some of her rooms were quite fine. But that was because she kept boarders for a living, and worked hard day and night almost to keep the rooms looking as nice as she could, in order to satisfy her boarders. A cheap boarding house, the people further uptown called it, though the boarders themselves never thought the price they paid was small, and grumbled a great deal about everything. Poor Mrs. Kedwin often came for a few minutes to pour her troubles into Mrs. Bryant's sympathetic ears, and to say she was running behind all the time. She was sure she did not know what was to become of them. On the whole, Mrs. Bryant, who did not see how her own family was to get through the winter, yet knew that she would not for a good deal have changed places with Mrs. Kedwin. As for the young people, who were about the same age as Ben and Line, it must be admitted that those two sometimes envied them, for they were still in school studying the same lessons that the Bryant young people longed to master. Yet Line confessed herself as vexed about half the time with Fanny Kedwin. "She ought to have been named If I Only Had," she said one day to Ben. "She is forever telling what she would do if she only had this or that, and she lets slip chances that might amount to something, just because she hasn't something else that would be nice to put with them. I've no patience with her." "Well," said Ben, "Rufus is just so. He hangs around Saturday mornings and tells what splendid paths he could make, and how much money he could earn, if he only had one of those snow plows, while I go to work with my old worn-out snow shovel and earn a few shillings. Every little helps, but Rufus doesn't seem to think so. If he can't do a big thing, he doesn't want to do anything." One evening, not long after the arrival of the dolls, Rufus and Fanny Kedwin came to spend an hour or two with their friends. Mrs. Bryant had gone out for the evening on an errand which often took her from home. On Duane Street lived a young couple with their baby, in a lovely home all by themselves. They had discovered that if they could get Mrs. Bryant to bring her sewing, and come and sit in their pretty little parlor with the door ajar into the bedroom, they could go to a lecture or concert together, leaving their darling in her care, and feel perfectly safe and comfortable about her. So many an honest penny did Mrs. Bryant earn in this pleasant way. Line and Ben were always glad to have her go, for they said it was a great deal easier way to earn money than to iron all the evening, or sit and sew. "Besides," said Line, "she can sit and sew at the same time. Be paid for staying there, as well as getting paid for the sewing. 2 earnings put into 1. Little Daisy was never able to reason about it in this philosophical manner. She made no complaints, but it was so nice and comfortable to have mother at home in the evening, and it was so lonesome to have her gone, that Daisy, as she sat in her own little chair, with D. Dunmore Bryant on her lap and Arabella Aurelia at her feet, looked sober and made very few remarks. In fact, she paid but little attention at first to what was being said, until Fanny, who had silently watched Line's fingers flying for a few minutes, for Line was hemming ruffles with which to trim the skirts her mother was making for Mrs. Potter, made this remark: "If we only had a machine, I might earn some money this winter. Miss Webster was asking mother today if she knew of anyone who could make some plain underclothes for her. Mother said she didn't unless it was your mother, but she said she heard your mother say she had on hand all she could do now. If we had a machine, I could do them as well as not, but there's no use in talking. I might as well wish for a piano and be done with it, as to wish for a sewing machine. I never expect to have either." "Oh, yes, you will," said Ben. "Rufus will buy you both one of these days, see if he doesn't." Line was not giving very close attention to this. Her thoughts were on the sewing. "Does she want her work done on a machine?" she asked presently. "Why, no, I don't suppose she would care about that. But then, who would do it without a machine? Great long seams and lots of hemming. It would just be drudgery. I wouldn't do it for anything." "I don't know," said Line. "It would be slow work, of course, but then, if one had nothing else to do, I'm about run out of knitting, I used up all my yarn. It is getting so late in the season, Mother thinks I could hardly get my money back if I bought more. I wouldn't mind sewing by hand if I could find anybody willing to wait until I got it done. There is very little on Mother's sewing she will let me do. She does such fine work most of the time." "Who is Miss Webster?" said Ben. "Why doesn't she do her own sewing?" "Why, she can't," said Fanny. "She is sick, you know. She hurt her back when she was a girl, and she can't sew, not even enough to mend her clothes, without making it ache. She does not work at all." "Oh, is she that one who rides around in a sort of hand carriage?" asked Ben. "I've seen her. I met her this morning out riding with her dog." "She's got the cunningest dog out," said Rufus. "He knows everything you say to him. Minds as well as a boy does." "He and Willie are great friends," said Fanny. "He lets Willie maul him dreadfully, and doesn't growl or look cross. This morning Mother scolded Willie real hard. He would keep jumping on Eben, and it hurt him. He squealed out as if in pain, and at last Mother gave Willie a box on his ear, and set him up on a chair where she told him to stay till he could behave himself. She spoke real cross, you know, and Eben knew his playmate was being scolded. What did he do but get up slowly from the corner where he had gone to get away from Willie, walk across the room and hold out his paw to Willie to shake hands. We all shouted right out, it was so cute in the old fellow, and Mother let Willie get down from his chair as soon as he said he was sorry. She said it would never do to have a dog more ready to forgive than she was herself." Then Rufus had a story to tell. "That is a great dog," he said. "I'd give a good deal if he was mine. Miss Webster tells us lots of funny stories about him. At home he is left to guard the stables a great deal of the time. They feel perfectly safe to leave fine harnesses and whips and everything out there, and the doors unlocked, because Eben will not allow anything to be touched unless it is some one he has been told has a right. When they got a new man, he had to be taken out and introduced to Eben before he could go to work." "Introduced," said Ben. "How do they manage that?" "Why, just as they would introduce anybody, and tell Eben he's come to stay, and must be allowed to handle the robes and whips and things." Ben was not much acquainted with dogs, and laughed a good deal over this idea. "I guess he wouldn't find much fault if a fellow should go to work who hadn't been introduced," he said. "Oh, but he would," declared Rufus. "Miss Webster told us of a friend of hers with whom Eben was well acquainted. He used to pet Eben and play with him, and Eben liked him very much. But the man had never been in the stables, till one day he stopped there to speak to Miss Webster's brother, who was upstairs looking for something they wanted. Nobody was there, only him and the dog, and he thought he would see how far the dog would let him go. So he took hold of the whip and started for the door. In an instant Eben was at his side, growling low, but in a way that meant business. Miss Webster said that man couldn't stir a step until he put down the whip. She said they used to tease the gentleman a great deal after that. They told him they felt perfectly safe, since Eben evidently understood his character." Whereupon Daisy spoke for the first time in some minutes. "Mr. Jones ought to have that dog for a clerk." "Why?" asked both girls at once, while the boys turned and looked curiously at her. "Because the clerk he has now lets the girls and boys take nuts out of the barrels when Mr. Jones is not there." "Why-ee," said Line, "that is stealing." "Pshaw," said Rufus, his face growing red. "What's a nut or two, or an apple? They didn't take a whole handful." "I should say that a nut or two, in a case like that, was a nut or two that belonged to Mr. Jones, and unless I had paid my money for them, I would much rather they would be in his hands than mine," said Ben. "I should think so," said Daisy gravely, but Rufus only laughed, though the flush stayed on his face. "I'd like to get Miss Webster's sewing," said Line. "I'd like to get Miss Webster's dog," said Ben, imitating Line's voice. Then they all laughed. "I can't arrange about the dog," said Fanny good-naturedly, "but I should think we could about the sewing. She really wants some done, very much, I should think. She has spoken to mother about it 2 or 3 times. I might tell her you could do it, and that your mother could help you if you came to places you didn't know how to do yourself. That is, if you really want it. But I never would. It is such dreadful slow work. It will take you ages to earn $1. "It will not take me so long as it will do to do nothing," said Line, smiling. "I'll tell you what," said Fanny. "Come over tomorrow and see her for yourself. She's real pleasant, not a bit stuck up, as some rich ladies are." "Is she rich?" asked Ben. "I guess she is. You ought to see her elegant things. Silk wrappers and embroidered skirts. She doesn't think any more about wearing them than I do about wearing calico. I shouldn't think she would care whether she had pretty things or not, though, lame all the while as she is. Still, it must be nice to have lots of money. She has been here for 3 winters. She always boarded at the Carroll House before, where they pay $20 a week for board. Think of that, Line Bryant! $20 for what one person eats and sleeps in a week. She came down to this street because she wanted to be near the little gray church on the corner. The minister there is a friend of hers, and she says on pleasant Sundays she can leave her window open and hear them sing, and imagine she hears them pray. That is the way she goes to prayer meeting. She told mother once that the hardest thing for her to give up was prayer meeting. Doesn't that seem queer? I can't imagine how a person can care so much for prayer meeting. It sounds awful wicked to say it, but I always think they are the dullest places in the world. If I had to go every week, I don't know what would become of me." "I don't enjoy them very well," said Line, "but I know people who do. Mother does, and she is always sorry when somebody must have ironing done on that evening. She always goes when she can." "You don't go, do you?" "Not very often," said Line, "this time of year. I stay with Daisy because she is too young to be kept up. It is such a long walk from here, you know. Ben goes to take care of mother." "I don't believe Ben likes it, do you, Ben?" "Do I what?" asked Ben, who had been giving close attention to something Rufus was describing, and had not heard what Fanny said. "Do you like to go to prayer meeting? Line said you went to take care of your mother, and I said I didn't believe you liked it. Do you?" "Not remarkably," said Ben, his face grave, his eyes fixed on the bit of board he was whittling. "No more do I," said Rufus promptly. "I never go unless I can't help myself. One night when Mrs. Knox was boarding at our house, there was no one to go with her, and I had to, and I thought it was the dullest place out." "Mother doesn't think so," said Daisy, in a tone that was meant to be reproachful. "Oh, well, your mother is older than we are," said Rufus promptly. "I mean for young folks, of course." "Some young folks like to go," said Line. "There was a girl in our class last summer who said she always went at home, and she wouldn't miss going for anything. She was so sorry she lived too far away from the church here to go." "I'll bet you the meetings she was used to were different from ours," said Rufus positively. "Or else the girl was different from us." It was Ben who said this, half in fun and half in earnest, but Daisy was wholly in earnest. It was clear that she thought Ben had given the true reason. "I'll tell you who I like," said Rufus after a moment's silence, "and that is the minister who preaches in the gray church. Do you know him, Ben? Miss Webster says he is nice, and I guess he is. But he doesn't seem like a minister somehow. I mean, a fellow doesn't feel afraid of him. He came along one day when we boys were having a snowball frolic. He stood and watched us a minute, then he took hold and snowballed with us, and he made a true aim every time. I'd like to hear him preach. Why don't your folks go there, Ben? It would be so much nearer than where you go." "Why don't your folks?" said Ben. Rufus laughed, and Fanny answered for him. "Our folks don't go anywhere most of the time. Mother is so tired, and there is always so much to do. Besides, Sunday is the very worst day in a boarding house. The people think they must have a good dinner that day, if they don't any other time, and the girls have to go out part of the day, or they think they are ill-used. I don't get to Sunday school more than half the time." "Keeping boarders must be hard work," said Line with sympathy. "It must be fun, though," added Ben. "So many different people to get acquainted with, and watch how they do things. I should think a fellow might learn ever so much in that way. There are some nice people come now and then." Rufus assented. "There's a man at our house now I guess you'd like. He's a writer of some sort. Letters, I guess, though people don't hire their letters written for them, do they?" "Some folks do, because men who have lots of letters to answer wouldn't have time to do it themselves." "That's so, but then they couldn't carry them round the country and answer them. Well, I don't know what he does, only he writes a great deal, and he has a machine to do it with." "A machine to write with!" exclaimed both girls at once, while Ben looked his astonishment in silence. "Yes, sir," said Rufus, enjoying the sensation he had made. "A machine to write with. I saw it and heard it. It prints just like books and papers." "I never heard of such a thing," said Line. "Rufus Kedwin, are you making fun of us?" "No, I'm not. It is all true, just as I tell you. I saw it today, and asked him lots of questions about it. He makes it go like lightning. I looked for you, Fanny, to come in and see it, but you hadn't got home from the grocery. After that I forgot it. He says he does all his writing on it, and that it is enough sight faster than any pen that ever was made. Easier to read, too. He takes it along with him wherever he goes. He has a case for it, and he carries it in his hand. Folks think it is a valise, he says, until he unstraps it, sets it on his lap, and begins to write. Then you ought to see them stare, he says. It is the cunningest thing out." "I suppose it costs a great deal of money," said Ben, his eyes large and wistful. A machine of any sort had a great attraction for him. "I s'pose it does," said Rufus, in a very important tone. "I don't believe you could guess how much. I asked him, and I was so scared at what he said that I whistled right out. You see, it isn't so very large, for all it's so cute. It didn't seem to me it could take much time to make one, when folks once knew how, so thinks I to myself, like as not it costs as much as $20. Ben shook his head and laughed. "I should say more than that," he said, "without seeing it. It must be a new invention, and new things always cost a great deal, even if they get cheap afterwards. I believe I should have guessed as much as $50 the first time." "Well, you might," said Rufus triumphantly, "and been a good deal out of the way, too. What do you say to a clean $100? Yes, sir," he added, while Ben was dumb with astonishment, and the girls exclaimed, $100 in good hard money. That was what he paid for the thing. Doesn't it seem tremendous?" "It seems as though a fellow could never afford to have one," said Ben with a half laugh. "What in the world would you want of one?" Fanny asked, looking at him curiously. Ben laughed again. "It couldn't be very easy to tell," he said. "I always feel a hankering after a new machine somehow, just as you do after a piano, you know. I never hear of one, but I think I would like to own it." "Well, but," said Fanny, "I could learn to play on a piano if I had one. There would be some sense in that." "So could I learn to play on a machine if I had one," Ben said quickly. Meantime, Rufus was getting ready to answer Ben's remark about price. "I don't know," he said. "If a fellow had the money, he could afford to buy one, Because they earn lots of money writing on them. This man says that lawyers and all sorts of businessmen are having their letters and law papers and things copied on this machine, and they pay a great price for it. If I only had a machine, I'd risk but I could earn my living. I know it is an easy thing to learn. I'd risk but that I could learn it in less than no time. I wrote my name on it. He told me I might, and it was just as easy. The keys go down with a touch. He said I might write on it every day and learn how. But what's the use in a fellow's doing it when he never expects to have one?" "Oh," said Ben, with a long-drawn sigh that was almost a groan, "what a dreadful dunce you are, Rufus Kedwin. How do you know what may happen to you?" "I don't," said Rufus good-naturedly. "I may tumble down on my way home and tear a hole in my best clothes. I've got on my best ones tonight because I did actually tumble down on my way home from school and got my others all muddy. There's no telling what may happen, but I'm sure of one thing as I want to be, and that is that I haven't got a writing machine and never expect to have one, and don't mean to waste my time learning to do a thing that I'll never have a chance to do." "I only wish I had your chance," said Ben. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. A New Acquaintance. The very next day after her talk with Fanny Kedwin, Line dressed Daisy in her one pretty apron of soft plaid gingham that looked like silk, and was made to tie at the shoulder in pretty loops that looked as much like ribbon as they could, being only gingham, and went to call on the invalid lady, who was so kind as to need some plain sewing done for her. There might have been 2 reasons for Line's choice of an apron. She liked to have Daisy look pretty in it, and besides she made every stitch of it herself. If the lady should just happen to want to see a specimen of her sewing, it might be convenient. Fanny Kedwin was not at home. This at first frightened Line, who was timid with strangers. She turned irresolutely from the door, half resolved to go home and wait until Fanny could befriend her, but the desire to secure the sewing before anyone else was found gave her courage, and she turned back. "Do you know whether the lady who wanted some sewing done has found anybody yet?" she asked of the girl in a very much soiled calico dress, who had opened the door. The girl knew nothing about it, and looked as though she would like to say, neither did she care. But Mrs. Kedwin was waiting at the head of the stairs to see whether she was wanted, and now came down a step or 2. "Is that Caroline Bryant? Come in, Caroline. Was Fanny speaking to your mother about the sewing? I didn't tell her to, for I didn't suppose it would do any good. Your mother said there was so much work in those wrappers and sacks that she could not promise anything else." "No, ma'am," said Line, "she can't. But I thought perhaps if it was only plain work, I might get it to do. Mother would see that I did it right, and I know how to sew pretty well." "You?" said Mrs. Kedwin, coming down 3 steps farther down the stairs. "I'm bound you do. You wouldn't be your mother's daughter if you didn't. But then, you haven't any machine, have you, child?" "Oh, no, ma'am, but Fanny thought perhaps the lady would not care if they were done by hand, if she wasn't in too great a hurry." "Care? I don't suppose she would. Of course, hand work is nicer than machine work. But who can afford the time to do it in these days?" "I can," said Line with a bright little smile, "for the reason that I haven't anything better to do. I mean that will earn money. It is getting so late in the season, Mother thought there would be no use in buying more yarn. I can't help with her sewing, that is, I have done all she likes to trust to me. The rest is very particular work. But Fanny said it was just plain underclothes which were already cut, and I thought perhaps—" "So you are willing to undertake plain underclothes by hand, are you? Well, there's a difference in girls, certainly. Come upstairs and I'll see what Miss Webster says. She is particular about her sewing, I guess, but I shall tell her that your mother's daughter ought to be able to suit her." It was such a pretty room into which they were shown. Line had not known that Mrs. Kedwin's house held so pleasant a spot. It was not that it was elegantly furnished. Indeed, the furniture was of the plainest. Just a cottage bedstead, with a bureau and washstand, matting on the floor. But there were the brightest, softest rugs laid about on the matting, crimsons and browns and pale greens and tints of delicate pink. Line touched them softly with her foot and felt their thickness and warmth. Axminsters they were, though she did not know it. They had followed Miss Webster in a large packing trunk the week after she had decided to remain at Mrs. Kedwin's, not so much because she wanted to be near the little church as because she wanted to help Mrs. Kedwin with the generous price she paid for her board. Then there were delicate curtains, hanging not only at the windows, but in all sorts of unexpected places. Line called them curtains. They hid the toilet appointments from sight. They drooped in graceful folds over the rows of shelves in the corner, where all sorts of pretty knickknacks were gathered, besides the choice books. There was even a curtain on the plain little table over by the fireplace. At least if it was not, neither Line nor Daisy knew what to call it. It was not the right shape for a table cover, according to their ideas. It was long and narrow, hanging low at either end, but not quite covering the sides. Line wondered why they did not put it the other way and cover the plain woodwork entirely, but admitted to herself that for some reason it looked prettier as it was. There were also a few pictures on the walls, which Daisy's beauty-loving eyes saw at once. Especially was there one which gave her intense satisfaction. A pretty little oval, representing a single plump chicken in the act of picking up a choice morsel. Its name, Chicken Little, was traced in rustic letters just beneath. It was a very pretty chicken, and looked extremely natural. It almost seemed to Daisy as though she could smooth down one of the feathers which was ruffled a little. But her special satisfaction in it grew out of the fact that she had but the day before cut from a stray newspaper a beautiful picture of a fat white goose, who seemed to be waddling across the grounds for a set purpose, there was such a look of intelligence in its eyes. Daisy had carefully cut it out, and then had been seized with an aesthetic doubt as to whether it was the proper thing to place a goose in the study. But now, she reasoned, if Miss Webster, who had so many beautiful things, believed a chicken to be an appropriate picture for her room, surely Daisy might set up a goose in hers. Miss Webster received her callers with the most gracious smile, insisted on their taking seats, said she was lonely and in special need of young company, and would talk to Line about sewing after they were rested a little and had become acquainted. Line smiled at the idea of being tired with the short walk from her home to Mrs. Kedwin's, but grew grave with sympathy as she remembered how impossible it would be for Miss Webster to take even so short a walk as that. Mrs. Kedwin went away, leaving them to get acquainted without her, having first made Line's cheeks flame by saying with energy, "She's to be trusted, Miss Webster. If she says she can do your work, why, she can. Mrs. Bryant's children are to be depended upon every time. I often tell my Fanny that if she does half the honor to her bringing up that the Bryant children do, I shall be satisfied. There isn't a better woman in the country than Mrs. Bryant, and she has a hard time like the rest of us." Line was glad to see the door close after that. It was embarrassing to be talked about in this way, even to have their hard times paraded before a stranger. Miss Webster was looking at her with an interested, sympathetic smile on her face, and she said softly as the door closed, "It is an honor to have a mother whom people cannot help praising, isn't it?" Some way that made everything seem nicer at once to Line. The flaming color began to die out from her cheeks. She looked up and smiled and felt more at ease. It was a very pleasant call. Miss Webster told the story of Chicken Little, and why that particular namesake had a place in her affection. Then she had Line hand her a box from the bureau, and displayed some brilliant plumage from South American and other tropical birds, and told little bits of interesting things about the birds who had worn them, until Line as well as Daisy began to think her the wisest, sweetest woman she had ever seen. "So you know how to use your needle?" she asked at last, when they were beginning to feel quite at home with her. "Yes'm," said Line simply. "I know how to do plain sewing pretty well, I believe. Mother taught me when I wasn't any older than Daisy, and I have helped her ever since when I could. I never undertook to do anything quite alone for other people, at least not for people who did not belong to our family, but I think I could, and Mother would show me anything I didn't know." "And you work evenings, I suppose, after school duties are over?" The flush began to creep into Line's face again. "I didn't go to school this winter," she said, speaking low. "It was not convenient for Mother to spare me. She has to be away quite often about her work, and she is sometimes kept so busy that she cannot do the housework at all. So I have that to attend to, and besides there were other reasons why I could not go." She did not propose to tell this stranger that it had reached the point with them where she had no dress suitable to wear to school. That the plain dark calico in which she looked so neat and trim this afternoon, and was her very best, was growing old and must be saved for Sunday, because there was no present prospect of being able to buy even a 6-cent calico. It was an undeniable fact that, despite the $50 which had come to them so unexpectedly through Daisy's letter, the Bryants were very poor indeed. "It is all owing to that horrid mortgage," Ben had explained to Line when they talked things over only a night or two before. "I never understood it until the other day. Mother said it didn't seem worth while to explain to us as long as there was no way open for us to help more than we were doing now. But I wish she had. We might have done something more, maybe, though I'm sure I don't know what." "What is a mortgage?" Line had asked almost fretfully. It seemed to her that they were having more than their share of the burdens of life. "Why, it is when you owe somebody and can't pay, and you give them a paper saying that if you can't pay at such a time, they will have a right to sell your house, or your cow, or whatever you pick out, you know. Then you have to pay interest on it every year, and that counts up like everything." "Give who a paper?" asked Line, bewildered by Ben's grammar and the wandering of her own thoughts. "Why, the man you owe," said Ben. Line was generally so quick to understand. "In our case it is Mr. Jenkins. It seems Mother owes him $1,000. Ben had made an impressive pause at this point to give Line a chance to take in the magnitude of the trouble. "Father did, you know, and Mother couldn't pay it when it was due. But she pays the interest, and he lets it run on, only he says every time that he can't wait any longer, he will have to foreclose. That is what they call it when they sell, you know, so Mother is kept in trouble about it all the time." Poor Line had felt that she did not know at all. These business phrases, which rolled so glibly from Ben's tongue, were almost as new to her as they were to Daisy. "I don't understand," she had said anxiously. "What have we got that Mr. Jenkins could sell? We haven't got anything." And she looked about the room with a bewildered, though troubled air. Few as their things were, and plain, of course they would bring something, and it would certainly be very hard to get along without them. "It's the land," said Ben gloomily. "The meadow and the garden, and this little shed of a house. They are all mortgaged to Mr. Jenkins. He could sell them all tomorrow, if he took a notion, and turn us out into the street, and Mother is afraid a good deal of the time that he will do it. I can see that." Line's face had grown pale. Here was trouble indeed. "But how came Father to owe Mr. Jenkins?" she had asked in great anxiety. Ben's face had flushed, and he had turned away for a moment, as though he had no answer for her. At last he had said, still with his back to her. "I don't know, but I guess at it. And I think that is the real true reason why Mother hasn't told you and me before. You know, Line, that Father used to go to Mr. Jenkins's place a good deal once." "I didn't know it," said Line sharply. "How should I? No one ever told me. What did he go there for?" "Rufus told me once," Ben said, after another troubled pause. "He did not do it to be mean. I came upon several of the boys suddenly, when they were talking about something, and they all stopped. Then Rufus thought that would make me think they did not like me or something of that kind, and he explained that they were talking about a man who was beginning to drink a good deal, and they were afraid it would make me feel badly. So they stopped talking when they saw me. I didn't understand that at all, and I kept asking questions until Rufus had to tell me that Father used to drink a good while ago, before Daisy was born, and that is the way he lost so much money and got into Mr. Jenkins's hands." "I don't believe it," Line had said angrily. "I don't believe one word of it. I should not think you would let Rufus Kedwin say such things about your own father, Ben Bryant." But Ben had only looked troubled and had sighed heavily for answer. And Line, ashamed of her words, had gone away quickly, lest in her trouble she should say something else that was unkind. She had cried for an hour, and made her eyes so red that she was ashamed to go to the store for molasses, and Ben had been very patient and kind and had gone himself, though he had just reached home after a long tramp. And, after all, Line felt obliged to confess to herself that the story was probably true. It explained a great many things which had been perplexing to her. It made her all the more anxious to get sewing to do to help her mother. Poor mother! So there were special reasons why she was not going to explain to this stranger how she came to be too poor to go to school. Miss Webster looked interested, but asked no more questions in that direction. Instead, she turned her attention to Daisy. "Are you a little sewing woman, too?" she asked. Daisy explained that she knew how to make quite a good many things for her dollies, and then, gathering courage from a look at the sweet face, added, "I tried to make scallops around the bottom of Arabella Aurelia's dress. My other little girl had embroidery on hers, and I thought Arabella Aurelia might like some scallops. But I could not cut them because Mother's shears were too large for my hands, and the little scissors are too dull." "Is that Arabella Aurelia?" asked the amused lady, pointing to a very little neatly dressed doll in Daisy's arms. "Oh, no, ma'am. This is just one of my little children. Arabella Aurelia never goes out with me. I love her very much, and I would be willing to take her, very willing indeed, but my sister Line does not think she looks suitable." Miss Webster decided in her own mind that this little child woman who had come to call on her was just the oddest morsel she had ever seen, but she kept her face properly grave, and asked what was Line's objection to Arabella Aurelia. Daisy looked at Line for help, but receiving none, put aside the fiction so dear to her own heart that the creature in question was real flesh and blood, and answered in her grave, grown-up tone, "She is not a truly dolly, ma'am. She is just the arm of a chair. It broke off and couldn't be mended, so I had it for my dolly. It has no eyes nor mouth nor any of those things, but I love her very much. I did, long before I had any other dolly, and I always shall. I would make her a scalloped dress if I could." The sentence closed with that quaint little sigh which always went to Mrs. Bryant's heart. It found Miss Webster's heart on the instant. She hardly knew whether to laugh or cry. "Climb up on that chair beside the table," she said after a moment, "and open that box with the silver clasp. I think there is a pair of scissors in it like the ones you need." Daisy gravely obeyed, got on to her knees before the opened box, and looked at the gleaming things within, her face all in a wonderment of satisfaction. silver scissors with gold handles, besides other shining things which looked like silver, but whose names and uses were unknown to her. "Try the scissors," said Miss Webster, motioning Line to hand her a bit of cloth from the work-basket. "Just make a pattern of the sort of scallop you mean, and let us see if those scissors would do the work." Down sat the little woman, her face taking on the most business-like air, and with deft fingers she folded the bit of blue flannel several times, and then cut dainty, pointed scallops. "They are lovely!" she said, her fair face flushing. "They cut down to the very tip-edge of themselves." Miss Webster laughed. It was impossible not to. "Then I want you to take them to Arabella Aurelia with my compliments. Tell her they are her very own, but that if she loves you half so well as you deserve, she will lend them to you whenever you wish. Tell her also that I shall feel hurt if she does not call on me as soon as her new dress is done, that I may see the scallops with my own eyes." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Ben's Visit. When Line and Daisy came back from their call on Miss Webster, Line had a good-sized bundle in her arms, in which were several pieces of work carefully cut and basted, ready for her hand. She felt triumphant, for was not this her first effort all by herself to help support the family? Ben was to go in the evening to get a certain kind of button for which Miss Webster had sent. "I think it will be sure to reach me in the afternoon mail," she had said. "You can tell your brother to come up to my room, then I can give him whatever other directions I have." "I don't want to go up to her room," Ben said, standing irresolute, hat in hand. "Why can't I just ask Fanny Kedwin to clip upstairs and get the buttons for me?" "But, Ben, she said you were to come up, and she would give you any directions she might have for me." "She can't have many new directions since 3 o'clock," Ben said discontentedly. "It is only 5 hours since you were there. Besides, Fanny can tell me the directions. I shall get them from her much straighter than I would from Miss Webster, you may depend. Won't that do, mother? I just hate to go upstairs." "Why do you, my boy?" "Oh, because. A fellow never knows where to step in a woman's room, nor how to act. It is all full of gimcracks, too. I shall be sure to smash something, or knock down something at least." "It seems to me that a fellow of your age ought to be able to enter a lady's room and stand by the door a few minutes without doing any very great harm," his mother said, smiling. Ben laughed good-naturedly, though he looked a trifle shamefaced. He knew his mother did not like to hear him speak of himself as a fellow, and she didn't like such words as gimcracks, neither was she especially pleased with the fits of exceeding shyness which occasionally possessed him. As he still stood in apparent irresolution, the mother added, "It is barely possible that she may wish to send a message directly by you, since she took the trouble to speak of it. At all events, it would certainly be courteous to do as she said." "Oh, well," said Ben, "I'll go up, of course, if you say so." He went away, wondering why things which did not trouble girls at all were so hard for boys to do, wondering also if mother and Line had the least idea how he hated to go up to that lame lady's room and ask for those buttons. He puzzled over it all the way to Mrs. Kedwin's, why such little things as these were hard, and why, since they were hard, it had to be a fellow's duty to do them. "It isn't that I'm lazy," he told himself, "or selfish. I'd go up 9 flights of stairs in a minute if it would do anybody any good." 5 minutes more, and with the puzzle still unsolved, he was knocking at Miss Webster's door, Rufus Kedwin standing at the foot of the stairs to make sure that he chose the right door. "Come," said a clear, pleasant voice, and Ben, wondering why she did not say "come in," turned the knob and obeyed. "Good evening," said Miss Webster. "This is little Daisy's brother, I suppose? Would you mind helping yourself to this chair here by the lamp? And tell me, please, which of these buttons you think are the prettier? My cousin has sent me 2 kinds, and I can't decide." "I don't know much about buttons, ma'am," said Ben, with an embarrassed laugh, as he took the chair indicated, and felt that his cheeks were ablaze. "Not? Don't you know now that there is a certain style of button which you prefer to all others for your collar?" "Why, yes'm," he said, laughing and wondering. How in the world did she know anything about his collar buttons? "I do like them to be just about right." "Ah, I was sure you did. That is just the way I feel about my buttons, only you see I am never sure which ones will be about right, so they give me some interested minutes. Did you ever imagine how many little things a person who cannot take a step has to plan to interest herself with?" "Can't you step at all, ma'am?" Ben asked, intense sympathy overcoming his timidity. "Not a step," she said, with great cheerfulness. "That is, not by myself. When my nurse puts both arms around me, and lets me rest my weight against her, I can walk quite nicely. But that, you see, is pleasanter for me than for her, so I don't entertain myself in that way very often." "I don't see how you can bear it," Ben said, conscious that there was a queer lump in his throat. "What, the not being able to walk? Why, I know so many trials harder than that sometimes it seems not worth mentioning. What would you think if I should tell you it had been the cause of more happiness to me than any other thing in my life? You would find it very hard to believe, wouldn't you?" she added, smiling at the look in Ben's brown eyes. "I'd believe it if you said so," he answered gallantly, "but I don't see how it could be. It seems to me I would be cross and miserable all the while." "I shall have to tell you a little bit about it," she said cheerily. "I had a little brother, the dearest, handsomest boy in the world. Only 6 years old he was, and I was 13. In the night, when my mother was sick, our house took fire. Father nearly lost his life in saving mother, who was quite helpless. And in the confusion, dear little Benny was forgotten for the moment by everybody but me. I had run to his room, which was quite a long way from mother's, so his voice would not disturb her morning rest. But by the time I had him in my arms and was ready to run, the staircase was on fire. There was no way of escape but by the window, and the fire was making such rapid strides that I felt sure poor Benny could not breathe the heated air long enough for them to bring a ladder, so I jumped to the ground with him in my arms. Think what a joy it was to me to be told that I had saved my little brother's life. That was the beginning of the happiness. Nothing was ever sweeter to me than my father's and mother's kisses that morning. But I have had a great deal of happiness out of it since." "Couldn't you ever walk again?" Ben asked. "Oh, yes, I walked for several years. But the jump hurt the nerves of the back in some way. They kept growing weaker and weaker, and at last they wouldn't work any more. They felt that they had done enough. But my little brother Benny is a tall, splendid boy, now almost 19, and just as good and brave and grand as he can be. He is going to do his work in the world, and mine too. Do it better, I dare say, than I could myself. So you see I have happiness out of it all the time. There are very few brothers in the world like mine. I couldn't begin to tell you of the number of things he does for my comfort. He seems to be always planning something new and nice for me." "I should think so," burst forth Ben, his embarrassment all gone, his eyes glowing with sympathetic feeling. "I should think he would feel as though he couldn't do enough for you." "Why?" asked Miss Webster, smiling. "Why, because," said Ben, almost indignant that she should ask the question, "didn't you pretty nearly give up your life for him? I should think he would almost worship you." Miss Webster's bright, kind eyes were fixed upon him, her voice was eager and pleased. "I am so glad to hear you say this," she said. "It tells me plainly that you are a servant of Jesus Christ, and think no service too much to give to him. I wondered if you were, when I heard your sister call you Ben this afternoon. You can imagine that I am especially interested in boys of that name, so I thought about it a good deal. I am glad to know. You do serve him, don't you?" Then you should have seen Ben's face. Astonishment, dismay, extreme embarrassment, these feelings followed one another in such quick succession as to almost take his breath away. What did Miss Webster mean? What had he said to lead her to make such a mistake as this? His eyes drooped before her earnest gaze, and he felt ashamed and pained to have to answer her question with a low-toned, "No, ma'am." "Oh," she said in a disappointed tone, "I am so sorry to hear that. Why, I don't understand it. How can you, who understood so quickly what my brother Benny felt for me, feel other than boundless gratitude and love for your elder brother who gave his life for you? I thought of course you returned his love. How is it, my boy? Why do you not belong to him?" Ben was silent for a few minutes, then murmured low something about being too young, and felt ashamed of himself while he spoke, his reply seemed so foolish. "Too young!" repeated Miss Webster in apparent astonishment. "That is strange. Benny loved me with all his heart years before he was as old as you, and I am sure you must know how to love. How is it with that little Daisy of yours who visited me today? You are not too young to love her?" Ben felt more ashamed than before. Still, there seemed to him something to say for his side of the question, and he answered sturdily that he always supposed there was more to do than just to love somebody. "Why, no," said Miss Webster quickly. "Nothing more than grows out of honest loving service, you know. Your love for Daisy does not permit you to sit still and see her suffer when you could do anything to help her. That is one form of service. Then how is it with your mother? Doesn't your love for her prompt you to obey her directions? What sort of love would it be which allowed you to deliberately do that which you knew would pain her or was in any way contrary to her wishes? Don't you see that honest loving means service to those who need, and loyal obedience to those who have a right to command? Aren't you old enough to love the Lord Jesus Christ and to follow his directions?" "Yes'm," said Ben frankly. "I suppose I am. I never thought of it in that way. Being a Christian always seemed to me something for old people, or for men and women at least." "I understand. You thought it something too great for young people. It is great, certainly, but it is like some other great things, human love for instance. Take Daisy and yourself. I know you both love your mother, but you can show it by doing for her things which Daisy cannot do because her arms are not strong enough. Yet, to the measure of her strength, I presume she shows her love in service." "Yes'm," said Ben. But even as he spoke he gave a little sigh. There came to him a thought of how little he could do to help his mother. Miss Webster studied his face a moment while he stared steadily at the door and winked hard. "There is very little you would not do for your mother if you could," she said gently. "I feel sure of that. What I want to have is a reason why you do not feel so toward Jesus Christ." "I don't know, ma'am," said Ben, after a moment's thought, turning honest eyes on her. "It doesn't seem so easy to me as the other, not by a good deal. I am with my mother every day, and I know her, and can talk with her, and hear her talk to me, and the other is very different. I can't seem to feel sometimes as though there were any such person. I mean as though he could hear what I said, or cared for me, or anything. I never thought I was ungrateful, but I don't—" A pause, then after a moment of silence, "You can't make yourself love a person, you know, ma'am." "No," said Miss Webster, That sort of love would be worth very little. But I'll tell you what you can do. You can make yourself serve a person. Suppose you undertake that." "I don't understand what you mean," Ben said, twisting uneasily in his chair, his face growing red. "Why, I mean, see here, am I right in thinking that you admire your mother very much, and would like above all things to give her pleasure?" "Yes, ma'am, you are. I think my mother is the best woman there is in the world, and she has lots of trouble, too. There is nothing in the world I wouldn't do to help her in a minute, if I could." "Then tell me this. Do you believe your mother would be pleased if her son were a servant of Jesus Christ? If she knew you had joined his army and promised to obey his lead in all that you did and said, would she be glad or not?" There was a sense in which it was very easy for Ben to answer this question. Many and many times had his mother said to him, speaking low, "I long to see my boy a Christian." And he had always answered either by silence or by a constrained, "I mean to be, mother, one of these days," whereupon she would sigh and turn away. She was not given to much speaking on this subject. She had not trained herself to speak freely even with her children about it. But Ben knew, none knew better, how much such a step as this would please his mother. Yet he had honestly thought he could not take it. Something, some mysterious process, must go on in his heart before he could be a Christian. He had heard repeatedly the phrase, "a change of heart." He knew that only God could change the heart, and without stopping to make this thought consistent with other things he knew, he had told himself that sometime, probably, that mysterious change would come to him, and then he would be a Christian. But in the meantime he did not like to think anything about it. But Miss Webster was waiting for her answer. He looked down at the floor and spoke low. "I know she wants me to be a Christian." "Then suppose you engage to do this. Not to love Christ, mind you, as you said you cannot make yourself love him, but to obey him, to study his book in order to find out what he wants done, and then to do it honestly as well as you can. Are you willing to please your mother by doing this?" "But the Bible says we must love him. That's the very first thing," said Ben, almost with an air of triumph. He had learned the verse in his lesson only the week before, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind." He thought Miss Webster was contradicting herself and getting her logic into a very narrow corner. "I know it does," she answered quickly. "But you and I are entering into an agreement to do what we can, not what we cannot. We are both agreed that you cannot, of your own power, make yourself love God, but you can make yourself obey some of his directions. What I ask is, will you take them up as fast as you find them, and live by them?" "Why, I do," said Ben sturdily, "if you mean the commandments and such things." "Do you? Do you pray, my boy?" "I say the Lord's Prayer generally at night." "And think of the words, and try to order your life by them?" Ben thought a minute. "No, ma'am," he said at last, looking at her with honest gray eyes. "I don't believe I think about the words much at all. I am so used to them I can't. They slip right off my tongue when my mind is contriving some way to do something that I want to accomplish." "Yes, I know all about that kind of praying. I mean a different kind. You are a very honest boy. I like that. We can understand each other a great deal better on that account. Let me ask you 2 or 3 questions. I know you will answer them honestly. Do you believe that you owe God your love and obedience?" "Why, yes'm, certainly." "Then, of course, being an honest boy, you want to give what you owe, so far as you can. Are you willing to follow my rule about it a little while? Suppose you promise that every morning before you leave your room you will kneel down and pray something like this: 'Heavenly Father, give me a heart that wants to love thee. Help me to obey thee this day so far as I can, for Jesus' sake. And at night, instead of saying, Our Father, will you say, Forgive the sins and mistakes of today, show me plainly what they are, and help me not to make them tomorrow? Will you do this?" "Why," said Ben, hesitating, while a deep crimson flush spread all over his face, "I suppose I could, but—" There he stopped. He wished Miss Webster would finish the sentence for him. He had not the least idea how to finish it. But she looked directly at him and waited. "I don't want to," he said at last. "That is honest. I am glad you own it. But for all that, I ask you to do it. And if I am not mistaken in you, you will. Didn't you tell me you ought, my boy?" Ben Bryant had never in his life before had so small an opinion of himself. He had always rather prided himself on his honesty. Something in Miss Webster's tone made him feel as though he was dishonest and mean. He did not want to make the promise she called for, yet he did not understand his own heart enough to tell why. Neither did he see any honest reason for not doing so. At last, drawing a long sigh, like one who was forced beyond his inclinations, he said, "I suppose I can do it, Miss Webster, if you think it will be of any use." She smiled on him brightly. "I am sure it will be of use in your case, because I take you to be faithful about anything that you undertake." Ben went home, thoughtful. Line questioned him curiously. What did he think of Miss Webster? What had kept him so long? Did she say anything to him beyond the directions about the work? Didn't he think she was lovely? Some of these questions he found hard to answer. He was in no mood to tell what Miss Webster had said to him. He put Line off almost gruffly, and gave his attention to Daisy. Her face was a study. She had retired to the farthest corner of the trim little study, and was bent over with her elbow on her knee, and her cheek resting on one hand, while in the other she held a small box of pennies and one half-dime, being, as Ben very well knew, all the money she had in the world. "It isn't enough to do anything with," she said at last, her voice so sad that it went to Ben's heart. "What did you want to do, Daisy Linda? You are not in need of another picture frame so soon, surely." He gave a glance around the decorated walls as he spoke. A new picture, a lovely little Christmas scene, had been mounted but the day before, and hung in a conspicuous corner. "Oh, no," said Daisy. "I was not planning anything for myself. I wanted to think of some way to help Mother. I heard her tell you and Line about the money, and that she didn't know how to pay it, but I have only 17 cents, and that won't do hardly any good at all. If I only knew some way to make it grow bigger." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Do It Anyhow. Ben was moving very slowly down the street. The night was cold, and he had his hands in his pockets. He was whistling to keep his courage up. The truth was, Ben was a good deal discouraged, and was also in some perplexity. Something troubled him very much, something that he had not told his mother, nor indeed anybody else. One of the perplexities was whether he ought to do so. He hated to get home while his mind was in such a whirl of doubt, therefore he walked slowly, though it was so chilly. In one of the pauses between the rather doleful whistling he was doing, came the distinct sound of a tap, tap, tap on a window pane. Ben stopped and listened. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. "That is Miss Webster's window," said Ben, looking up. "I wonder if she can be tapping for somebody. She can't walk, and maybe she wants something. But maybe it is only the elm branches tapping against the window. Dear me, I wish I knew. I'd go up in a minute if she wanted anything, but it would be awkward to go and find it was only the elm tree knocking." While he waited, the street door opened and Fanny Kedwin looked out. "Ben," she said, "if that is you, Miss Webster says she wishes you would come up to her room. She wants to see you." "It is me," said Ben, without regard to grammar. "But I don't know what she wants of me. Do you?" He followed Fanny as he spoke, somewhat reluctantly. He admired Miss Webster very much, but felt exceedingly shy about meeting with her. "No, I don't," said Fanny, shortly. "She wants to preach to you, I suppose. She preaches to us, or about us, most of the time. She is always talking about how young folks ought to do, or might do, or something. I'm tired of her. She is just an old maid. What do old maids know about young folks, I should like to know? If it had not been for her, mother would have let Rufus and me go to that masquerade party tonight. I had just the prettiest notion about a dress, and it wouldn't have cost much of anything. Mother was almost willing, until she went and talked with Miss Webster, and then she said no outright. I'm tired of her. I wish she would go home. I don't care if she does pay more for her board than mother asks." By this time they were at the head of the stairs, and Ben had only a chance to say, "Seems to me you are in ill humor tonight," when Fanny knocked sharply for him at Miss Webster's door, said in answer to the invitation to enter, "Here's Ben Bryant, ma'am," and vanished. Ben thought it was a very awkward way to introduce him, and wished he had coaxed Fanny to stay. "Come in," said Miss Webster briskly. "Did you hear my tap tap on the window? You didn't think I was a raven, did you? Take a seat. You are not in a hurry, I hope? I have been watching for you all the afternoon. I wanted to send Daisy a picture." "A raven?" repeated Ben curiously. Miss Webster seemed always to be saying something to surprise a person out of his embarrassment, and set him to puzzling. "Why, yes, you know the raven came tapping, only that was at the chamber door. Did you never hear the story of the raven? How, when the gentleman was nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of some one gently rapping at the chamber door?" Miss Webster's voice was very musical, and Ben was extremely fond of rhyme. He smiled as he said, "That was what came to me out there on the street, only I knew it was on a window. But I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it might be the branch of the old elm tapping against the window, but it sounded to me like a person." Miss Webster nodded her head. "Just so," she said quaintly. "History repeats itself. Only you were not napping. If you had been, you might have said, 'Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, that I scarce was sure I heard you." "Oh, I heard it very plainly," Ben said, laughing at he hardly knew what. "But I don't see what it has to do with a raven." "Why, it was the raven who knocked. At least, that is the way the poem runs. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched above a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more." Ben's amazed look set Miss Webster off into a merry laugh. "You should hear the whole story," she said. "Some of it is very quaint, and some of it is very sad. One cannot help feeling sorry for the poor fanciful brain that could get up such a strange conceit, and put so much sorrow and despair into it." She had for the moment forgotten who her listener was, and lost herself in a sorrowful thought of some sort. Then she came back to Ben with a smile. "I did not mean to compare myself to a raven, nor to give you snatches from Poe." "Poe? What a queer word! Is that the short for poetry?" "Oh, no!" and Miss Webster laughed again, but not unpleasantly. "That is the name of a famous poet who wrote the poem from which I quoted, Edgar Allan Poe, and his poem called The Raven was one of those which made him famous. Ben's face crimsoned. He began to understand that he had been exhibiting a good deal of ignorance. "I don't know much about poetry," he said humbly, "nor books of any kind." And he sighed. "Of course not," Miss Webster said brightly. "You are young yet, you see, and opportunity is all before you." "I haven't had a great deal of opportunity," said poor Ben, thinking of the school to which he could not go. "More than you realize, I dare say," Miss Webster replied, with a wise nod of her head. "The way to do it is to pick up little bits of knowledge wherever you find them. They lie around so loosely all about us, only the trouble is we so often go blindfold. I don't suppose a day passes but that you and I add to our stock of useful information without realizing it, and fail of adding a good many little items that we might, just because we do not realize or recognize them." Ben looked interested and puzzled. "I'm sure I don't know where mine are. I must be blind most of the time. I don't see any of them." "Really? Have you not learned a single new thing today? Think." "Not a thing," Ben said promptly, then hesitated and laughed a little. "Or, I don't know. I did learn that dried peaches had gone up 2 cents on a pound since yesterday, but I don't know what particular good it will do me." "Is that so?" said Miss Webster interestedly. "What is the reason, I wonder? They must be getting scarce in the market. It is getting toward spring, you know. If that is so, they will go higher still. I'll tell Mrs. Kedwin. She may want to lay in a supply before they take another jump." "They will go higher," Ben said promptly. "That is, Mr. Perkins thinks so. I heard him talking about it to Mr. Wood. Just happened to hear it, you know. I wasn't interested. I didn't suppose I cared." "But you see, you do. Your item may save Mrs. Kedwin several pennies. Oh, things fit in where one least expects them to. I've always found it so. Here is this poet whose acquaintance you are making tonight. He will do for item number 2. And there is no telling when he may be useful to you." Ben laughed. This was getting to be a very queer talk, but he enjoyed it. "I don't know much about him," he said. "If he is going to be useful to me, I ought to know more than his name." "As to that," said Miss Webster with a sigh, "there is not much to know about him that could be helpful, except in the way of warning. He was a genius who wasted his life." "When did he live? Ever so long ago?" asked Ben. "Oh, no, he belongs to this century. Has been dead only a few years. Died young, too, only 38, and died in poverty and sorrow." "A scholar and a poet!" exclaimed Ben in dismay. "Yes, indeed. Many a brilliant young man has been ruined by rum. I hope you fight alcohol in whatever form you find it, my friend. A boy named Benjamin should always be a foe to anything that can intoxicate." "I am," said Ben, but his face looked troubled. Was this Mr. Poe a drunkard? "Poor fellow, he was almost everything bad. I do not know a sadder life belonging to a genius than the one he lived. He must have been started wrong. His father and mother were strolling play actors, and both died when he was a little fellow. Then a rich man named Allen adopted him. That is where his middle name came from. He was Edgar Allan Poe, you remember. He was sent to school, and had every opportunity, and wasted them all. He was expelled from the university for all sorts of disorderly conduct. Then he quarreled with his adopted father, and went off in anger to a foreign country. He was going to be a soldier and do great deeds, but he brought up in a police cell in St. Petersburg. His long-suffering adopted father received him back, and tried again and again to make a man of him, and always failed. At last his patience was exhausted, and the poor idiot had to take care of himself for the remainder of his life. It ended, as I told you, in a sorrowful death." And he wrote beautiful poetry? Some of it is beautiful. He was a genius, and yet he was an idiot, as I said. How very strange, Ben said, drawing a long sigh. I did not know that people who had chances and brains ever finished up in that way. Oh, they do, often. The truth is, life is full of such slippery places that the only chance worth thinking about is the one held out by the Lord Jesus Christ. Those who lean on him are safe from falling, and no others are. Well, now you see you are slightly acquainted with Edgar Allan Poe, and with one of his poems, all growing out of my tapping on the window pane tonight. And you don't know yet why I did it. I have a picture for Daisy. Has she framed her goose yet? Yes'm, said Ben, answering the smile in Miss Webster's eyes with a laugh. My sister Line framed it for her with some red paper that came around some of the things at the store. Did she tell you how troubled she was at first about hanging a goose in the study? Line told me, said Miss Webster, breaking into a merry laugh. She is a dear little sister, is that Daisy. I have a picture for her which I think she will like. The child's face is not sweet like hers, but it is pure and good, and the lamb is very natural. I took the liberty of framing it. I hope Daisy will not object. As she spoke, she drew a portfolio from the table, and produced an engraving of a gentle-faced little girl, with a kitten in her arms and a lamb at her side. The picture was framed with a broad band of embossed gilt paper, something altogether more elegant than anything Daisy's collection could boast, and yet entirely in keeping with her idea. Even Ben exclaimed over the beauty of it. She will like it so much, he said eagerly. I can't tell you how much. She is a very queer little girl. I don't know how she happens to have such odd notions. She does not seem a bit like other little girls. She is a flower, said Miss Webster tenderly. A lovely little wild wood flower that must not be spoiled by cultivation, and yet must be trained so that it will bloom beautifully for the Lord of the garden. Ben looked at her in respectful silence. He did not quite understand this, but he gathered that Miss Webster certainly thought their little Daisy very sweet. And now, said that lady, when she had carefully wrapped the picture in white paper, tied it with a blue cord, and addressed it to Daisy Isabel Bryant with the love of the sender, how does Daisy Isabel Bryant's brother get on? You have kept the promise you made me, of course? I've tried to, said Ben, growing gloomy at once. But I don't get on very well. Things are in a good deal of a muddle, and that very thing muddles me more, I believe. Then it is clearly your duty to tell me all about it, because if I have helped make a muddle for you, it stands to reason that I should try to help you out of it. Oh, it isn't your fault, said Ben, twisting in his chair and trying to smile. Only, you see, things in a fellow's life don't fit that sort of praying, and he's got to live his life, of course, and it just makes things mixed up and miserable for nothing. That is a grave statement, and needs careful looking into. I'm not sure we would agree as to the logic. Let us take it up in sections. Things in a fellow's life don't fit that sort of praying. That is a statement of fact, is it? Then of course I must accept it. But the next, he's got to live his life, of course, that I quarrel with. From my standpoint, I should say he hasn't got to do any such thing. If the steps we took during that last talk were true, and you and I agreed they were, and that we would abide by them, why, then it is plain that this fellow's life must be changed to fit the praying. That's easy to say, declared Ben sturdily, resolved on being honest at whatever cost to his politeness. But it isn't such a very easy thing to do, I can tell you. Nobody promised that it should be easy, my boy. In fact, we said nothing about that. It was a secondary consideration, of course, after it had been once settled that a thing had got to be done. Do it, easily if you can, but do it anyhow, is the motto of such a life. When you have first settled that you ought, there is no place for any such suppose. There is never an ought when there is an honest cannot. The two looked at each other steadily in silence for a few moments. Apparently Miss Webster had not the least idea of retreating from her position. "Well," said Ben at last, "I don't see my way clear, I know that." "Is it something which you can tell me? Perhaps I can help you think it out." "Why, yes'm," he said after a moment's slightly embarrassed pause, while the red on his cheeks grew deeper, "I could explain, but there are other things which would have to be explained before you would understand. You see, the way of it is, my father is dead, and my mother has it all to do, except what little we can do to help. And there are some debts that were made when he hesitated, and Miss Webster came to the rescue. "I understand perfectly. There are debts which your mother is trying to pay, and which make it hard for her. That is so often the case with a widow that it might almost be said to belong to most stories of life. And you older ones want to help in every possible way. So much is clear. What then?" Ben drew a long breath. How well she had made it all sound! And not a word had been said that reflected on his father's memory. "Well, the next thing is, it is one of the meanest towns in the world for a boy to get work in. I tramped through every street in it before I got this place in the grocery, and I shouldn't have got it then if the boy who was there before hadn't broken his leg. There are more boys than there are places, you see, or else there is very little doing. I don't know what makes it, but I know it is as much as a fellow's head is worth to get a place to earn anything. In summer, when the canning factory is open, I can get work enough, but that only lasts for a little while, and it is a good while yet to summer." "But as I understand it, you have a place in the grocery. Are you thinking about how hard it was to get it, or borrowing trouble, or what?" "Why, you see," said Ben, then he stopped to laugh. "Maybe I am borrowing trouble. At least I can see that something is coming. I've either got to stop one thing or the other. They sell hard cider at the grocery where I am." "Well?" said Miss Webster, looking steadily at him as he spoke these words in a significant tone, and she waited for him to say more. "And the boys drink it. Some boys whose folks don't know it, I guess, and who can't afford the money for it, if that were the only thing." "Well?" said Miss Webster again. Some way he had not imagined that it would be so hard for her to understand. "Why, the fact is," he said, dashing into the subject now with all haste, determined to make it very plain, "I'm an out-and-out temperance boy, beer and cider and all of them. I don't believe in sweet cider, let alone hard." "But you don't have to sell cider, do you?" "No'm," he said, speaking more slowly, the troubled look coming back into his face, "that was what I thought all the time, until I began to do this other thing that you wanted me to, and for the life of me now I can't seem to make them match. The praying and the living. What if I don't sell it? I'm there, and the boys, some of them, come in to see me, and after saying a few words to me, they order a glass of cider, and I look on and can't say a word because I don't suppose I have any business to preach against it when I'm in the employ of the man who sells it. And I suppose some of the money he pays me comes from the cider barrel. I was all right enough because I didn't drink it myself nor sell it to others, until I began to pray that prayer, you know, and it doesn't seem to me the two can be made to match." If Ben had been looking at Miss Webster just then, he would have seen a quick flash of pleasure come into her handsome eyes. But he was looking at the floor. "I comprehend the situation, I think," she said at last, after waiting for a minute to see if he had more to say. "But I don't think I understand where the perplexity comes in. Didn't I understand you to say you were in a muddle?" "Yes'm," said Ben. "Do things seem to you to fit?" And he gave her a furtive glance. "Oh, no. But Ben, my boy, are you really in a muddle as to which ought to be given up, the praying or the business?" End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Getting into Close Quarters. This was bringing things down to a fine point, or, as I am afraid Ben would have expressed it, getting a fellow into close quarters. He had no answer ready for her. Truth to tell, he was a good deal surprised. She had seemed so far from understanding him that he had, some moments before, reached the conclusion that she was not a very strong temperance woman, and would perhaps think him a trifle silly for attaching so much importance to a few drinks of cider. It was this thought which had increased his determination to stand by his colors. But the tone of her question put to flight all such fancies as these. It was only too evident what answer she expected him to make. "But what is a fellow to do?" he asked, almost impatiently. "There are reasons why my mother ought to have the little bit I am earning." "Not if you are earning it in a way that she would not like. On which side of this question is mother, my boy?" Then did Ben's eyes droop. "I haven't said a word to her," he murmured at last. "She doesn't know anything about there being cider sold at the grocery. She doesn't go to a grocery from one year's end to another. She hardly ever even goes down that street." "On which side will she be, Ben, when you tell her about it?" That was a very ingeniously put question. How did Miss Webster find out that he was going to tell her about it? But he answered her presently, his tone still low, "She hates cider worse, if anything, than I do." "And she hates sin, and wrong, and compromise with conscience of any sort, doesn't she?" No reply. Then presently, in a cheery tone, "It seems to me, Benjamin Bryant, that you are trying to answer too many questions at once; or, to put the thought in another form, trying to take certain steps before you reach them. The first thing to do is to get away from this cider barrel; that is, if you are settled that the two do not match. And I certainly understood that such was your deliberate opinion. As to what you will do next, of course you cannot answer that until the next thing comes." "There isn't any next thing. There isn't another place in this town where a fellow can get any work. I've been thinking about it all the week, and I know there isn't. More than that, if I should leave Mr. Sewell now, when I've just got used to the work, it would vex him, of course, and he wouldn't recommend me." "All of them steps with which you have clearly nothing to do, my friend." Miss Webster spoke with a quiet smile which was intended to be encouraging, but some way it irritated Ben. "That's easy enough to say," he said, pushing back his chair with a vim, "but you don't know anything about how hard things are. Why, even little Daisy realized the need for helping so much that she counted out her 15 cents and cried because it wasn't more, and because she didn't know how to help," he added. "Let us talk about Daisy for a few minutes," said Miss Webster suddenly. "You have reminded me of something which I wanted to ask you. Daisy told me about her dollies. What is she going to do with so many?" "I'm sure I don't know," Ben said, a little astonished at the sudden change of subject. He did not feel in the mood to talk about dolls, but since Miss Webster did, there was no help for him. "She fixes them in rows about the study, as she calls it, and tries to teach them a great many things, but they are about as worthless a lot of creatures as ever sat around and did nothing. We hardly know what to do with them in our little house. It seems queer that so many dolls should have been sent to her when—" But there Ben stopped. He had almost said, "when we needed so many other things, and didn't need dolls, only one." But if there was anything he hated, it was parading their needs in any way. Miss Webster laughed. "She tries to teach them, does she? That reminds me of my little sister Faith. She had a great many dolls. They accumulated, you know. The circle of relatives was large, and Faith was a great pet with them all. She clung to her dollies as treasures. None of them seemed to wear out. She was a most imaginative little creature, always trying to teach her dollies what she had just learned herself. Your little Daisy reminds me of her in many ways. She doesn't look like her, as you do like my brother, but she has her sweet, fanciful ways. I must show you a picture of Faith. I have a great many. One of Father's pastimes was the taking of Faith's picture in every imaginable attitude. He had an amateur photographer's outfit. There, I see by your face that you are not quite sure what that means, and want to know. Good for you. That illustrates what I meant by picking up knowledge. Why, the word amateur doesn't strictly belong to us. It is stolen from the French partly, and partly from the Latin, as so many of our words are. There is a Latin verb amare, meaning to love, and amateur is made up out of it and used to describe a person who loves a certain art or profession or study, and pursues it when he can get a chance, but does not earn his living by it or make it his life's work. Then I'm an amateur machinist, I guess, Ben said with a little laugh. Are you? Are you fond of machinery? We must have a talk about that. Well, Father took Faye's picture one day when she was posing in the middle of her bed before she was dressed in the morning, trying to teach half a dozen dolls a new figure in calisthenics. Ben looked puzzled, and Miss Webster stopped to laugh. You are fond of language, at least, she said, not at all as though his curiosity troubled her. That is a borrowed word again, from two Greek words, one of them meaning beauty, the other strength, and the word itself is applied to an exercise of the body and limbs, its object being to strengthen the muscles and teach grace of movement. It is reduced to a science, and is taught in most city schools nowadays. Faith had just learned some new movements, and was teaching the dolls, when my father opened the door. He thought her position a graceful one, and took a picture of her. Here it is. Isn't her face sweet? Where is your sister Faith? Ben asked, studying the pretty picture with one plump foot on tiptoe, crossed over the other. In heaven, said Miss Webster gently. Faith is sure to be swift and graceful in her movements there. I often think of her as intent on some sweet service for the king. Miss Webster had the strangest way of talking about heaven, Ben thought. The next moment she laughed merrily over the dough faces of two of the dollies. They were pretty dolls, she said, but you see they did not take well in the picture. They were shadow-struck, or light-struck, I suppose. These are some of the terms which seem to belong to the profession. I remember we asked Father if the dolls would not sit still. You wonder where my bright idea is, don't you? It has to do with still another picture. Father made a photograph of dollies one day, all the dollies we could gather in the neighborhood. I grouped them for a tableau, and their pictures were sold at a child's fair which was held for the benefit of the orphan asylum. They brought a good deal of money. I thought of it when you called your sister's dollies worthless. It is never safe to pronounce anything utterly worthless in this world, my friend. Here's the picture. Did you ever see so many cunning dollies grouped together? Ben looked and laughed and admired. It is the cutest picture I ever saw, he said. I should think it would have sold well. What are they all about? Why, there's one sewing. They are doing all sorts of things, said Miss Webster. They represent the woman who lived in her shoe. You know, she had so many children she didn't know what to do. That largest one isn't really a dolly at all, but a little girl made to look like one. She really sat in a large pasteboard shoe in the tableau, but that didn't show in the picture. They are at work getting their mother ready to go to the fair. It was a very good likeness of Nettie Chalmers. I presume that helped to sell the picture. When I came across it the other day, it made me think of your Daisy's dollies. Why doesn't she go into business, Ben? "Go into business?" said Ben, bewildered. "Why, how, ma'am? What do you mean?" "Couldn't a cunning little dolly store do well here, don't you suppose? Besides the dolls, a great many things could be made for them to wear. Dresses, you know, and bonnets, and sacques, and shawls, ever so many cunning little creations. Your sister Caroline could do such work beautifully, I am sure, and I have rolls of scraps just longing to be made up into Dolly's wardrobes. Why couldn't you set Daisy up as a saleswoman? You say she wants to help mother. I don't believe but this is a chance for her." Ben looked more astonished still, but interested. He laughed a little, but it was over a fancy that he had as to what Daisy might say. The more he considered the plan, the more it seemed to him a good one. Line could certainly do her part, for he had often heard his mother say that she was very skillful with her needle, and could do fancy work beautifully if there was any way to get her started. "But would people want to buy such things?" he said at last aloud, speaking doubtfully. He was so used to planning carefully about every purchase, and cutting off what did not come under the head of necessities, that it seemed strange to think of people spending money for dollies and dollies' clothes. "Oh, yes," said Miss Webster briskly. "Some people would. It is the only way they have of getting them. There are girls who have plenty of money, and plenty of leisure, who could no more make a dress for their little sister's doll than they could build a house. They haven't the talent, and don't want to spend patient labor in acquiring skill. Oh, I should think in a town of this size a very good custom could be worked up." At that moment came a sound which turned their thoughts in a new direction, a little clicking sound, new to Ben and curious. He stopped in the midst of the question he was forming to listen to it. "Do you think that is someone else tapping at the window?" she asked, smiling. "That is a writing machine. Hasn't Rufus told you about it? He was very much interested in it for a few minutes. I thought he might perhaps learn to work it, but he didn't seem to care to." "He said he saw one," Ben answered eagerly, "and he tried to tell me how it went, but I couldn't understand very well. Have you seen it, Miss Webster? Does it really look like print? And can he make it go as fast as Rufus thought?" "I don't know how fast Rufus can think," said Miss Webster, smiling over Ben's eagerness and his confusion of sentences, "but I know a way in which we might test it. Suppose you knock at that door for me, and see if we cannot stop this racket and get a glimpse of the chief performer." In much delight and some trepidation, Ben tiptoed across the room and did as he was told. The tap-tap in the other room ceased. A moment, and the door between the rooms was opened, revealing a young man with his hair somewhat rumpled and a pencil behind his ear. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds," said Miss Webster cordially. "We hope you will excuse us for interrupting, but I have a young friend here who is very eager to see that little wizard on which you play in such a manner that it can give you back your thoughts. Would it be too much trouble to bring it in here for our especial benefit?" "Not at all," the young man said, with great promptness. It would give him pleasure to do that, or anything else, for Miss Webster and her friends. So the little machine was seized with as much ease as though it had been a commonplace piece of furniture, and set down on the table in Miss Webster's room. "She's a beauty," Mr. Reynolds said, seating himself before her. "A regular beauty. I've never worked one who behaved quite so well. Some of them get rather confused in their minds after being knocked about on the railroad for a few weeks, especially if they are not carefully packed. But this one is as clear-headed as she was on the day we left home. Did you ever see one work, young man? Then we'll start her off." Mr. Reynolds spoke of the little creature as though she were alive, and really it almost seemed to Ben that she was. He bent over her with parted lips and quick breathing, amazed beyond measure, when after the lapse of a few seconds the performer lifted the roller and revealed in neat print the words, "John quickly extemporized 5 tow bags." You see, said Mr. Reynolds apologetically, when Ben read the line and Miss Webster laughed over it, I'm in the habit of writing these words because they contain every letter in the alphabet, and therefore it is a good sentence to learn on. It is some time since I learned, but the habit is upon me when I'm showing her off to give that sentence for the first one. It is a suggestive sentence, I'm sure, laughed Miss Webster. John was a remarkable boy if he could extemporize bags, 5 of them at that. Ben did not hear her. He was intent on the machine. I don't understand, he said. Where is the ink? Not a bit of ink about it, Mr. Reynolds declared, enjoying the puzzled face. Then it isn't a self-inker, but it prints with ink. Is that a ribbon running through there? Why, it rolls itself up on those wheels, and the ribbon is inked or colored or something. I begin to understand. But where are the type? Mr. Reynolds silently lifted the roller, then the ribbon, and pointed to the type with his finger, at the same time going through a pantomime which told Miss Webster that he considered the boy's intelligence and curiosity worthy of response. Sit down to it, he said heartily. Write your name and Miss Webster's name, or write Tau Bags if you want to. Can't I get it out of order? Ben asked, his face flushing with pleasure as he took the offered seat. Oh, yes, you can, but you won't. I've had boys look at it that I'd no more let try it than I would a polar bear, at least unless I was on hand to guard it all the time. But I have a notion that you are of a different stamp. Ben hardly heard the implied compliment. He was at work trying to print his mother's name. This, after patient effort, he accomplished. To be sure, it was spelled with a little b, and he struck U for Y at first, making it Bryant, but he discovered his mistake in time to correct it, and guessed out the way to move back the roller so as to do it. What do you think of it? Mr. Reynolds asked, watching his face as he looked up from this effort. I can see that there's a chance to do fast work after a fellow once learned where the letters were. I don't quite understand why they have put the A so far away, though, replied Ben. No more do I, said Mr. Reynolds significantly. Sometime, when you get to be an expert, you must go down to the manufactory and see if you can find out. Miss Webster, there's a difference in boys, as sure as the world. I gave a young fellow of your acquaintance a chance to write his name one day, and after struggling over it a while, he said, I don't see the use in learning this thing. I can write my name enough sight faster with a pen. Both Miss Webster and Ben laughed, Ben feeling sure in his heart that the boy was Rufus. It sounded so like him. Several more names were tried, and then with a masterly effort Ben struck off on his own account and wrote, Suddenly there came a rapping, as of someone gently tapping at my chamber door, only that and nothing more. This he showed to Miss Webster, much elated because there were only 2 mistakes in the print. That is well done, Mr. Reynolds said emphatically. Yes, said Miss Webster, so it is. The gentleman had reference to the machine work, but Miss Webster thought it was worth something to have remembered Poe's lines so correctly, having heard them but once. You have a good memory, she said to Ben significantly. Yes, said Mr. Reynolds, he has. He recalls the position of the letters, having once used them. That shows he would make a rapid operator. Then Ben and Miss Webster exchanged looks and smiles. They understood each other. I'll tell you what we'll do, young man. It was Mr. Reynolds who was speaking. We'll strike up a bargain, if you say so, to help each other. I'm in need of a boy to do some roller work for me, and in return for your services I'll teach you to write on that machine, or let you teach yourself, which is better. That is, if you have any leisure evenings. I study evenings, Ben said. I'm at work during the day and have to make what I can of my evenings. But that would be study. I think mother would be willing, sir, and I'm sure I should." Ben's eyes were so full of eager delight that he did not need to add those last words. Mr. Reynolds, looking at the eyes, laughed in a pleased way. "Then we'll call it a bargain," he said, "if mother is willing. I shall only need you 2 evenings in a week. I don't get ready for printing oftener than that, but you may come up to my room and practice on the machine a little while each evening, if you can manage the time, and I really think it will pay you to do so." Then there was a tapping at Miss Webster's door, and another caller was announced. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. What's the use? "Good evening," said Miss Webster heartily, as the door opened in answer to her invitation and revealed a tall gentleman. "How fortunate! You are the very person I want most to see at this moment." "How fortunate for me," said the newcomer in a cheery voice, as he crossed the room with brisk step and shook hands with Miss Webster. "It cannot be because you are lonely, either." And he glanced interestedly first at the 2 strangers, then at the machine on the table. "Oh, no, it was because I wanted you to meet my friends. Let me introduce to you Mr. Reynolds of New York, the Reverend Mr. Holden, Mr. Reynolds. And this is my young friend, Benjamin Bryant." "Ben, how do you do?" said the cheery voice, and the boy who had imagined himself shy of all ministers felt his hand grasped in a hearty way, as though he had been an old friend. There followed as interesting a half hour as Ben had ever spent in his life. Not only was Mr. Holden interested in the machine to such a degree that he asked numerous questions which Ben was longing to ask, but had not dared, but his own intelligent questions in regard to it drew out from Mr. Reynolds several important points. Besides, he was apparently, to that young man's great astonishment, interested in Ben himself. At least, he asked numerous questions for which there could have been no other explanation. On the whole, it was in undisguised amazement and some dismay that he started up suddenly at the sound of the great clock on the corner striking 9. "Are you late?" Miss Webster asked, in answer to the dismayed face. "Will your mother worry? I'm afraid we have been careless. Tell her it was all owing to the tapping of an old raven on the window pane, instead of the chamber door." "She will not be worried," said Ben, smiling over the raven, "because I am sometimes kept at the store, and she knows I don't stay anywhere but where she would be willing to have me. But I was going to do some things this evening, and now it is gone." "All the raven's fault," said Miss Webster cheerily. "But perhaps it has not been a wasted evening. You have learned some things about the machine." "Oh, no, indeed," said Ben eagerly. "I have learned a great many things, and had a beautiful time." "And I have learned that dried peaches have gone up in price and are going higher," said the lady merrily. "Did you know that, Mr. Holden? I'm going to make a note of it to tell Mrs. Kedwin." "I didn't know it," Mr. Holden said, in the same tone. "Don't tell my landlady, please. Ben, my boy, come and see me some evening, will you? I live just around the corner in the stone house. I shall be very glad to have a chat with you about machines and any other interesting matter." Ben went away smiling. Their tones were very merry, but there was nothing about either of them that suggested to him he was being made sport of. On the contrary, it seemed as though they were his intimate friends whom he had known a long time. He went home slowly, thinking about it all. Happy also over the fact that Mr. Reynolds had said to him, the last thing before he took his machine away, "Come in tomorrow evening, and we'll talk business." That sounded delightful. Would his mother think he could spare the time to learn to work that splendid machine, he wondered? Of course it was not very probable that he could make the knowledge of use to him, not for years at least. But then, who knew? He had a chance to do some of his thinking aloud. Just as he turned the corner which brought him in sight of home, Rufus Kedwin joined him. "Where have you been all the evening?" he asked. "I stopped for you to go to Jimmy Brower's with me, and they said you hadn't got home yet. Your mother said she supposed you were at the store, but when I passed the store it was closed." "Did you tell my mother so?" Ben asked, a note of anxiety in his voice. "Why, no, I hadn't passed the store then, you know, but I did 5 minutes afterwards. Is that the game, Ben? You been spending the evening somewhere where you would rather she wouldn't know?" Ben drew himself up proudly. "Not unless your mother's house is such a place," he said stiffly. "My mother's house? Have you been to see me? That's great, and I was in search of you, and would enough sight rather have had your company than Jimmy Brower's. But how came you to stay? I wasn't there." "No," said Ben, laughing, in spite of his dignity, over such a manifest truth. "You were not there. I should say that was plain. But neither was I, not in your part of the house. I was up in Miss Webster's room." Rufus gave a low whistle. "All the evening? Poor fellow! What have you been about to get caught in such a scrape as that? You had at least 16 solemn lectures on the duties and responsibilities of life, I'll venture." "I had a very pleasant evening," said Ben with emphasis. He felt himself growing dignified again. He had never liked Rufus Kedwin so little in his life as at that moment. "I think Miss Webster is one of the nicest and pleasantest women I ever saw," he said, after a moment's consideration as to how to put his thought. "Oh, of course she is, pleasant as June weather, a great deal of it, and nice is no name for it. Mother thinks so too. But honest, Ben, don't you think she is rather, well, poky, you know, or something of that kind? Preachy, maybe that's the word for it. A fellow can't go by her door, seems to me, without getting a touch of the importance of his opportunities, or something of that kind." "Well," said Ben, "if she tries to help a fellow to do a little thinking, I shouldn't think it need to hurt him. She hasn't said any more to me than mother does, nor half so much. But I saw some other people tonight. I saw that writing machine you told about, and Mr. Reynolds, and Mr. Holden." Ben spoke as though the writing machine were one of the people, and the first in importance. It almost seemed so to him. "Mr. Holden?" said Rufus with a little start. "He's the last man I should want to see. I don't like him anyhow. What did you think of the machine?" "It is the most wonderful thing I ever saw," Ben said heartily. "Why don't you like Mr. Holden? I thought he was splendid." "Oh, because he meddles too much with other people's business. Never mind him, he's nice enough for those who like him. Did you write any on the machine?" "I wrote mother's name. I'm going to learn to write on it, that is, if I can spare the time. He offered me the chance. He wants some work done, and he says if I will give him 2 evenings, part of the time, I can write on the machine the other part and learn how. Isn't that a good chance?" "Humph," said Rufus, "a dirt cheap way of getting a fellow to work for you, I should say. Of what earthly use does he suppose it will be for you to learn to write on that machine? In 2 months at the latest he will take it away, and you'll never see another, and what good will your knowledge do you?" "How do you know I'll never see another? Perhaps I'll have one of my own some day." "Oh, well, perhaps I'll have a balloon and ride on it to the moon some day, but I don't believe I will." "I don't either," said Ben with a good-natured laugh, "because you wouldn't know how to manage one. If you ever had a chance to learn, you would say, 'What's the use?' and let it slip." "I know the difference between chances and shams, I hope," Rufus said sharply. "I call this a sham, to get a fellow to work for nothing. He offered it to me, and I let him know what I thought about it. At least, I hope he understood." "I think he did," Ben said significantly. "Good night, old fellow. I'm at home, and, as the man in the paper said, I wish you were. Just because you hate to walk alone so badly, you know, and have been walking out of your way to keep me company." and Ben went in at the kitchen door, confirmed in his resolve to learn to run the writing machine if possible. Everything was quiet in the neat little study. Daisy was asleep in her bed, but Mrs. Bryant and Line were sewing steadily. Line had a history open on the table beside her, and occasionally glanced at the page as she sewed. "How late you are," were Mrs. Bryant's first words. "Do they mean to keep you often as late as this at the store?" "I left the store at 7 o'clock or a little after," Ben said promptly, "and I haven't seen it since." "Why, what does this mean? Where have you been then?" There was a note of anxiety in the mother's voice, despite her desire to trust her boy. It was a wicked world, and the town in which they lived held many boys who delighted to prowl around the streets of evenings. She always felt that this was one of the roads to ruin. Was it possible that her Ben might be dropping into it without even realizing it himself? "It was all on account of a raven tapping on the window," said Ben, bursting into a merry laugh. "At least that was what Miss Webster said, Mother. I wonder if you will understand her better than I did." Even before the mention of Miss Webster's name, Mrs. Bryant's face had cleared. No boy could come into his mother's presence with such a cheery, innocent laugh, who had been doing anything not just right. At least that was what she thought. Perhaps she had too high an opinion of boys. "I don't know much about ravens," she said, smiling, "and you are talking in riddles. Have you been to call on Miss Webster?" "Been there this whole evening. She tapped for me, you see, on her window. I couldn't think at first what the sound was. That set us to talking about the raven tapping. It is a poem. Did you ever hear of a poet named Poe, Mother?" "Edgar Allan Poe?" said Mrs. Bryant, taking neat stitches in the shirt front. "Oh, yes. I've heard of him and his raven, Nevermore. There is nothing about the doleful creature to remind me of Miss Webster, though." "I never heard of him," said Ben, with that added note of respect in his voice which a boy cannot help feeling when he makes new discoveries in regard to his mother's fund of information. "She isn't like a raven, I don't suppose. She isn't like anybody that I ever saw before. I've had the nicest time." And, late though it was, he launched forth into a description of his evening, a description in which the wonderful machine figured largely, of course. In the course of it he could not help contrasting his mother's views with those of Rufus Kedwin. "What do you think about it?" he asked, a trifle anxiously, having told her of the offer for some of his evenings. "Why, I think it is a grand opportunity," she said with enthusiasm. "It will be a change of work, and you will be learning to make yourself useful in a new way, at the same time that you are acquiring a wonderful art. For it really must be wonderful to write as fast as you describe." "But there isn't any likelihood that I can make it useful to me, you know," said Ben, still somewhat anxiously. It was right that his mother should consider all the objections in the way. "I should have to own a machine if I ever earned any money in that way, and they are terribly expensive. Just think, $100! Of course I shall never have one of my own." "How do you know that?" His mother asked the question so coolly that it almost took his breath away. "Why, Mother," he said, and stopped. She glanced up at him and quietly smiled. "It is impossible to tell what may happen in this world," she said cheerily. "A great many wonderful things have happened, even to me. Once when I was a little girl and had an opportunity to learn how to harness a horse, I said, 'What's the use in learning? I shall never have a horse to harness.' But I learned, and because I did, I had a chance to save a child's life. Oh, it is a long story, too long for tonight. I'll tell you about it some time, but it is one of the things which taught me to learn all I could in any proper direction, and be ready, when the opportunity offered, to put it in practice. You may never have a writing machine, it is true, but then again, you may. Stranger things than that have come to pass, my son. Since you don't know any certain future, Get ready for a possible one. That is my rule." "I'm glad of it," said Ben with great heartiness. "It is just exactly what I wanted to do, but I didn't know but you would think it foolish. You ought to hear Rufus Kedwin go on about it. He hasn't your ideas, I can tell you. Mother, I wish he could hear you talk sometimes. That boy needs something. I wonder if his mother— I suppose there are as great differences in mothers as in anything else." These pieces of sentences, thrown out in jerks, set Line into a bubble of laughter. "Why, Ben," she said, "what's the matter? I should think it was a sphinx instead of a raven you had visited with tonight, by the bits of wise sentences you toss out. I should think there was a difference in mothers. If you mean Mrs. Kedwin and mother—" "Softly, softly," warned Mrs. Bryant. "Well, but mother," interrupted Ben, just as Line was about to speak, "Rufus does have such queer ideas, and it seems as if—" But he broke off again. A dim idea that his mother would not approve of his saying that it seemed as though Rufus would have been better had he been better managed by his mother, held back his sentence. To Line he said, when they were down cellar together getting some forgotten potatoes for morning, "Did it ever strike you that Rufus had pretty low down notions about what folks do, or what they might do?" "It has struck me that he has rather low down notions about a number of things, Ben. What do you mean in particular?" But just then a gust of wind blew the light out, and Ben did not explain. It occurred to him afterwards, as a strange thing, that in the excitement of telling about the machine, and the offer, and the minister, he should have forgotten all about the subject which was troubling him so much when Mrs. Webster tapped on her window. It did not enter his mind again until the next morning, when he was skimming along the street on an errand for the store. Just as he turned into Dane Street, a little fellow with his satchel of books on his shoulders, making a cross cut across the pond for school, fell at full length. He did not seem to be hurt, and it was a common enough occurrence. Ben, halting a moment to see that the boy was being helped up, would have dashed on, and thought no more about it, but for a sentence which caught his ear from a rough-looking boy standing by. "Ha, ha! I guess he's been to Sewell's and got a drink of his cider this morning, and it has made his legs tipsy." A coarse laugh followed those coarse words, and Ben, as he hurried on, felt the hot blood mounting to his very forehead. Sewell's was the store where he spent his days in hard work. "I don't believe I'll stay there another day," he muttered. "I'll talk to mother anyhow." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. I think as much. Another thing that Ben had forgotten was Miss Webster's scheme for setting Daisy up in business. He thought of it at dinner time when he saw the dolls set in solemn rows about the study, and heard Daisy's grave remark that she was afraid they felt crowded, but it was the best she could do. But it was 2 days before he had a chance to talk the matter over with his mother. Daisy was close at her side all day, and in the evening Mrs. Bryant went out to care for the sleeping baby while its parents were away. Meantime, he did not wait for Daisy's absence to settle that other question. They were at the tea table when he made a bold dash into what, for several reasons, was hard for him to say. "Mother, does what I earn at the store help you a good deal?" "Yes, indeed," said Mrs. Bryant, with great heartiness. "You will never realize how much it helps, Ben, until you come to be the provider of a family. Perhaps you won't even then," with a bright little laugh which really covered a sigh, "because it is just possible that your pocketbook will be so well filled that you may not realize little helps, but I can assure you I do." This was a bad beginning. Ben was so silent and grave over it, that his mother, watching him a moment, hastened to add, not but that I believe we could get along with less, if you see your way to better things in the future by taking a little less wages now." And Line said, "Oh, mother, I don't see how we could." "The worst of it is," Ben said at last, finding that his mother was waiting for him in some anxiety, "that I don't see any way to earn a cent anywhere else, and yet—" Then he came to a period. It was very trying when they were all so anxious. Line felt as though she would like to shake him, and even gentle Daisy asked, "Why don't you tell about it quick, Ben?" "I think as much," said Line. "Have you lost your place, Ben? I'm sure I don't know what we will do if you have. We just manage to live now, and that is all." Said Mrs. Bryant, "Be quiet, Caroline. Ben, my boy, tell mother what it is that troubles you. Have you had any accident at the store?" "No, ma'am," said Ben, low-voiced, and wishing with all his heart that Line and Daisy were both asleep. "There hasn't been any accident, only I've been thinking a good deal about things lately, and I'm afraid some of them you wouldn't like. I know I don't. The long and short of it is, mother," he said, gathering courage as he thought of the sprawling boy on the ice, and of the laughing comments, "they sell cider at our store, lots of it. Sweet cider they call it, but I don't think it is very sweet, and—" Another period. "Have you been called upon to sell cider?" Mrs. Bryant's face was growing pale, and there was a dangerous flash in her eyes such as her children seldom saw there. "Oh, no, ma'am, of course not. There wouldn't be any chance to think twice if I had. But you see, mother, the boys like me pretty well here in town, and they drop in there to see me, and get in the habit of taking a glass of cider, when maybe they wouldn't if they didn't come for my sake in the first place. And then, anyhow, a fellow doesn't feel exactly consistent somehow, to be in the store where the thing is going on, when he has such ideas about it as I have." Mrs. Bryant was not through with her supper. The bread had given out, and they were having a treat out of a cup of sour milk and a stale loaf from the baker's. The two, with the help of a little soda and salt, had changed into some delicious flannel cakes, which had made Daisy wish that the bread would always give out just at supper time, so the evening meal had been prolonged beyond its usual length. But Mrs. Bryant laid down her knife and fork, and came with a quick step to her son's side, put one hand on his head, and with the other lifted up his face and deliberately kissed it. "And you do not want nor mean to stay there," she said. "God bless you, my boy. If you had given me $100 bill of your own honest earning, it would not have begun to give me the pleasure which those words do. Of course you need not stay, not another hour. We can manage, even if you find nothing else to do." Said Line, in her most emphatic tone, "I think as much." As for Ben, he had a chance once more to contrast in his own mind the difference between mothers. On his way home he had occasion to stop at Mrs. Kedwin's to deliver a large order for dried peaches, and had stood talking with Rufus a moment, during which they had discussed an item of news. "Joe Bailey has gone to Peterson's saloon as a clerk," announced Rufus. "He gets real good wages, too. Did you know that, mother?" "No," said Mrs. Kedwin. "Take the applesauce in, Dinah. Jane, look out for that stew, it is burning. I wish folks didn't have to have stews and all sorts of things for their supper, after having a good dinner. It doesn't seem necessary. I'm glad of it, Rufus. His mother needs good wages if anybody does, and Joe will save some of them for her, I suppose, though he isn't the best boy in the world, I'm afraid." Mrs. Kedwin always had to mix her conversation with directions to the girls about tea, or baking, or some household care. She rescued 2 dishes from a tumble, and gave 3 more orders, before she replied to Ben's dismayed exclamation, "Why, Peterson keeps a liquor saloon." "Well, he keeps oysters and other things, too. Still, I suppose Joe will have to help at all of it. It seems too bad, but I don't believe he'll take to liquor, he has had such a sorry example set before him in his own home. He was quite a big boy when his father froze to death after a drunken spree. I should kind of hate to have him there if I were Mrs. Bailey, but what can poor folks do? They have to take what work they can get, and work is very scarce in this town. I'm glad you've got a good place, Ben. I hope you'll hold on to it, and I know you will, for everybody knows you are a good, steady boy, and your mother needs your help." And then Ben had gone home to the supper table and the flannel cakes, and told his short, troubled story, because he felt that he mustn't dally with his conscience another minute, that something happened all the time to make it seem harder to take a stand. Was it much wonder that the contrast between mothers struck him forcibly? "So now," he said to himself, "it is plain sailing as far as mother is concerned. What a tip-top mother she is! The next thing is, what will Mr. Sewell say?" What he said was to argue with his young clerk, to assure him that he had given satisfaction, and would be sure to rise in time, and then to do what was a very unusual thing for Mr. Sewell, actually offer him a little more wages. And then, as it finally became necessary for Ben to own that he had no other place in view, that he was very anxious to work, that his mother needed the money, and that the cider barrel was the sole thing in the way of his staying where he was, Mr. Sewell, after taking it pleasantly, as a sort of joke at first, and trying to argue him out of his position, grew positively angry, called him a fool, declared that he would give him no recommendation whatever, and that he hoped it would be a long day before he found work that he did not deserve; that all this palaver about principle was just an excuse for getting a chance to loaf around in idleness, and that he would ruin his mother with his pig-headedness, as his father had before him with his bad habits. "Serves me right," said Ben, drawing himself up to his full height, and looking as manly as possible. "All this abuse serves me right, Mr. Sewell, for having been mean enough to go to work in the first place in a store where they sold hard cider for sweet. If my mother had known it, I wouldn't have stayed here an hour, but I never thought of it at first. I wonder how I could have been such an idiot, and I promise you I never will be again." Whereupon he walked out of Mr. Sewell's store, resolved never to enter it again. Trembling, he was, so that he could hardly walk. The idea of that man insulting the memory of his father! Oh, to have been able to say, "It is false, and you know it. My father had no bad habits. My father was always a grand, true man." "The mean, mean fellow," he said aloud, burning with indignation, "when he knew my father reformed, and for years and years before he died never drank a drop. How could he bear to say such a thing as that to his son?" If he had not been on the public street, a long way from home, I think Ben would have broken down and cried outright, so keenly did he feel the sting of the insult which had been given to his father's name. Like all insults, the bitterness of it lay in the fact that it had about it a shade of truth. But it was something which must be borne in secret. Not for the world would he have let his mother know what that man had said. He brushed away a few of the bitterest tears that had ever gathered in his eyes, and gave himself at once to the wearisome business of looking for a chance to earn something. A vain look, so far as this long day was concerned. There was not even a horse to be tied to a post, or untied for some lady driver. There was absolutely nothing all day by which he could earn a cent to carry home at night, and, though it was the middle of the week, Mr. Sewell had refused to pay him anything for this week's work, assuring him that he had forfeited it, at the same time refusing his offer to stay the week out, as Ben had supposed he must in honor do. "I'm glad he did not require it of you," Mrs. Bryant said, when told that part of the story. "Very glad indeed. I would not have had you 2 more days more in company with a cider barrel for all the money a month's wages would give me." It was certainly very nice to have such a mother. Nevertheless, Ben's heart was heavy during the 2 days that followed. Not a thing to be found to do. He had not even the pleasure of trying the new machine, and making himself useful if possible to Mr. Reynolds, for that gentleman sent word that he had unexpectedly been called out of town, and would not be able to see him until the following Monday. "A fellow might study lots if he only could," Ben said gloomily to Line, as he stood beside her while she washed the dinner dishes on the afternoon of the second day. "But you see, my mind is so upset by having nothing to do that will bring in anything, that I can't make it take to figures or dates or anything. I believe I will learn to sew. You and mother seem to have work enough. Here, give me that cloth. I can dry these dishes anyhow." Occasionally he found himself wondering whether it might not be possible that the pleasant-voiced young minister might know of something he could get to do. Twice during the afternoon he was tempted to go and see, yet something held him back. I am glad, on the whole, that he did not go, because of a little conversation which Miss Webster had with the minister that evening after Ben had gone. "That is an unusual boy, Richard," Miss Webster said. "He has a good face," said the minister. "He is a good boy. I am deeply interested in him, especially just now." Then she told about the mother's circumstances, and Ben's desire to help, and the cider barrel, and the disturbed conscience. "I shouldn't be surprised if I could find employment for him," said the minister. "Can you? I hoped you could. But, Richard, I wish you would wait for a few days until he works out this problem by himself. I hope he will leave there, even before he finds other work. And I think I even hope he will have to wait a little while, after he has left, before work comes to him. It will make him stronger for the future, I believe." "I see your point," said the minister, smiling. "Well, we will wait and see. Let the will assert itself so far as it is able." So, on the whole, I am glad Ben did not go to the minister just yet. That evening he found opportunity to lay Miss Webster's scheme about Daisy before his mother. "I don't know," she said, smiling and sighing, after it had been fully talked over. "It is very kind in Miss Webster to think of it, and I do not know but it might be the beginning of help in a very small way, but Daisy is the queerest child who was ever born, I think sometimes. There is no telling what she will think of it. I almost fancy she will oppose it, and I shouldn't like to force the child into anything of that kind." Mrs. Bryant was found to understand her small daughter better than Line and Ben did. They declared that they thought she would like the scheme very much, but she, on being told of it, looked not only grave, but deeply grieved. "Mamma, oh, mamma," she said in the most distressed tone imaginable, a tone which had also a touch of reproach in it. "Sell my children! What if I have a great many? Suppose you had 35 children?" "Oh, dear," said mamma. "Well, but mamma, I know you haven't, but just suppose you had. Would you like to open a store and sell them? Would you now really? Even if you could make as much as a whole $1 every little while?" "Daisy!" exclaimed Line, while Ben leaned back in his chair and gave the first hearty laugh he had indulged in for 2 days. "You are the most ridiculous child who ever lived, I am sure." But Daisy was grave and firm. "Mamma, would you think of such a thing for a moment?" "Little daughter," said Mrs. Bryant, controlling her inclination to join Ben's laugh as she saw the distress in her child's face, "there is not the least doubt in my mind that I would not think of such a thing for a moment, not if I had thrice 35 children. But, dear child, do you remember one thing? My children would have souls which would live forever. Have yours?" Poor Daisy! She looked down at the bit of work she was doing for one of the 35, choked and swallowed, and had much ado to keep back the scalding tears, while she faltered out, "I play they have, mamma." "Yes, my dear, I know you do, and that, I think, would make the tremendous difference between your case and mine. That is my little daughter's gravest fault, perhaps, that she plays too seriously. I like to have you use your imagination to a certain extent, dear. It is worth a great deal, at your age, to be able to do so. But there is such a thing as carrying it to an extreme, and I have sometimes been afraid that you did so. Not merely in this case, but do you remember how hard you cried when Arabella Aurelia fell into the tub of soap-suds, though it did not hurt her dress even, and you knew it wouldn't? However, for Daisy's head was still drooping, and it was evident that she had nothing to say, we will not talk more about this now. You will never be obliged, daughter, to carry out any plan of this sort unless you wish. It would probably not amount to very much in any case, and if you do not like to think of it as one way of helping you to learn how to be a little business woman, you need not. You are still too young to have heavy griefs, if mother and brother and sister can shield you from them, and if you really love the 35 with all your heart, we shall never consent to the sale of one of them. We shall find a way out of our perplexities without that sacrifice, I feel sure." "Of course we shall," said Ben, heartily. "I shall find work very soon, mother. I feel it in my bones to-night. And Daisy need not part with one of her children. I sympathize with her." "So do I," said Line. "Poor little mouse, I remember just how I felt when my rag dolly dropped into the soap barrel and had to be burned." In many ways they tried to cheer their darling, and make her feel that the 35 children were safe and most welcome. But for all that, she made up her mind, only a few weeks thereafter, to part with them. The processes by which she arrived at that conclusion were very queer. End of chapter 12.